What's up, everybody? Welcome to this episode of True Crime and Cocktails. We're so glad that you're here. As always, I am your host, Lauren Ash, and as always, I am joined by my co-hostess with the mostess, Christy Oxborrow. How you doing?
I'm gonna share
Oh,
a shame
a shame.
that I have gone through this weekend. A lot of OG True Crew members are going to understand this, and some of our new listeners may not, and be like, "You're such a weirdo," and you're right, I am. My son had a football game, and it went a little longer than I thought, and I had to go by about the half, and I was like, "It's okay, it's okay. It'll be done soon. It'll be done soon."
Yeah.
And then there was so many stoppages in play, and it just dragged out so long that before I left that field, I had to use a porta potty.
Oh, dear. Well, you say a shame. I say gross.
Well, I haven't even said the worst part. First of all, you could smell it from 3 feet away.
Oh,
So I knew that would be a problem. I hovered so that I didn't have to sit. I used a lot of the hand sanitizer. It's fine. I came home afterwards, and the way that I made myself feel better, I don't even know why I'm saying these words. I went online and ordered a bunch of stickers to put on my laptop.
Again, I feel like you are growing at an exponential pace.
I don't even know who I am anymore. I'm using bathrooms outside. I'm putting stickers on my laptop. I'm like a new person, and I don't understand it.
You're a whole new lady, and I'm here for it.
It's a whole new world.
Don't you dare close your eyes.
I always know if I'm gonna volley that Disney lyric, you're gonna spike it down.
Yeah.
No.
Bump set spike.
Yeah.
Exactly. Now, I have to just say, I'm wearing one of our Halloween pieces of merch, and I wasn't going to make Halloween merch. And then I just came up with this idea. You said something about 2 ghosts.
Yeah.
Representing each of us. And then I found the little magnifying glass and the little martini, and I was so jazzed. I was like, this is the cutest thing I've ever done. And I magnified the eye on what I would call the Christy ghost. And I was so proud of it.
Mhm.
And I don't know why, but like this one, I was like, every time I look at it, I go, every time. I just think it's so cute. And I put it up on the social medias, and everybody has been, very enthusiastic, which is lovely. But some of the enthusiasm is that because ghosts say boo, and there's 2 ghosts, people are comparing it to like boobs. And I just want to say that it never even entered my mind. Like I feel like I'm operating from a place of like childhood wonderment, just creating my art. And I was like, oh man. I feel like I'm 8, and that my like 16-year-old like badass older brother was just like pointed out like, well, that's a sex thing. And I was like, oh. But also in my defense, I'm like, it's not necessarily a sex thing.
No, it's adorable. But it also, I fully get that. Like, you're so proud. You drew like this beautiful bird, and you're like, look at this bird. I love it so much. And someone just in a car driving by looks like a dick. Like,
and then you're like,
that's the feeling.
It kind of does look like a dick. Yeah, exactly.
And you know why it is? Because you're too pure for this earth.
Bless your heart, bless your soul. We're gonna go and do some rock and roll. No, I appreciate that
tone.
I do feel like it was a pure thing, and I do think that that's what the merch is for me. It is like I for some reason have just really taken to it. I really enjoy doing it, designing it, creating it, whatever you want to label it as. And it is just like, it really is that like, then I get my clip art and I get my fonts and I see what I can put together. And yeah, and it never even entered my mind like a nana.
It's a beautiful thing. It's like when I give my youngest, who's in the first grade, if you just hand him a pack of markers and some paper, he will draw things that to him are the most beautiful things he's ever created. Some of them are cute, and most of them I need explanations. But the joy of creating is there. And you have that childlike wonder in creating joy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And those ghosts are adorable.
Thank you. Yeah, I think they are very cute.
The eye that's bigger because it's in the magnifying glass. The little mouth looks like it's taken a sip of that cocktail.
Oh, yeah.
Like, come on. I can't wait. I have not, I mean, I guess technically it's not even on. Are they on sale yet?
They're on sale. Yeah. Well, they are. Yes. As of the airing of this episode, they definitely are, but they are also as of the recording of this episode.
Oh, well, it shows which side of this cast you and I take care of. When you're like, I'm wearing this shirt. I'm like, God, when does that go on sale? And you're like, it's actually on sale now. This is not an ad. This is just me not knowing our own show.
Well, yeah, no, listen, again, we have our own tasks.
Yeah, I've been knee deep in, oh, fuck, he's an asshole. We're not going to like him, folks.
I love it.
I've had a lot this week for this particular gentleman. And every time I had to Google just a single date, I was like, there's a court thing. And I wanted to be able to say a date. Every time I Googled it, I found something else that I'm like, oh, I should add that. But then I add that into my notes and I'm like, oh, but I still need that date. So I go get the date. Nope, can't find the date. I found something else. And I had to put a stop to it and print out what I found and refuse to let myself use my laptop because I knew if I had access to Wi-Fi that I would look more because we never stop. So this is normally when I'm printing out my notes, I don't like my paragraphs to be too long because then my eyes get lost in the words.
Yeah.
So I try and make, shorter sections. Well, the sections are quite long and I filled 29 solid pages. So I am
if I could,
ready to go.
In the immortal words of Christy Oxborrow, that's obscene. It's not obscene. It's not obscene.
It could be worse.
I think I was at 46 when you said that's obscene. So 29 is perfectly reasonable. I was just excited to make a callback.
It's I appreciated it. Know that I did.
Thank you. Jerry Lee Lewis is who we're talking about on the show today, which I cannot wait for. Not Jerry Lewis. Two different men.
Yeah.
If you're thinking that we're talking about Lady, we're not talking about that one. We're talking about Great Balls of Fire.
Correct.
I just cracked myself up with that one, which is so stupid.
No, I think it's beautiful. And also Jerry Lewis, Lady Jerry Lewis. If I can say, and I know he's dead, so he won't hear me, but did you have to pick Jerry Lewis as a name? Like it was his stage name.
Yeah.
Did you have to do that? Because it made my work a little bit more difficult than it had to be.
It's interesting because the internet didn't exist back then. And I could see somebody doing it now, like somebody who was like, I'm going to make my name close to an already famous person to try and like gain followers or views or Googles. But back then, I mean, I don't know. Maybe he thought he could get booked on shows or something if they thought that they were getting Jerry Lee Lewis. I don't know.
Well, I think actually Jerry Lewis was popular before Jerry Lee showed up.
So wait a minute. So Jerry Lee Lewis. So who are we angry at?
Oh, I'm angry at Jerry Lewis for choosing the name Jerry Lewis, but I think he did so before then. I don't know. It wasn't in my notes.
Okay, well, Jerry Lewis is a notorious asshole, so we can be angry at him either way. No offense if Jerry Lewis is related to you and he was your papa. I'm so sorry. I'm sure you had a great relationship with Papa Jerry, but for the rest of the world, he was notoriously curmudgeonly, and also problematic. I think lightly problematic.
Oh, spoiler alert. Same. Apparently, the name carries a lot of similarities.
There you go. Fun fact.
Yeah.
Jerry Lewis.
Lady. Yeah.
Never, once he got famous, never wore the same pair of socks twice.
What?
This is something I read. He apparently really liked the feeling of fresh socks, and he was a man of means. And so he would toss them. So bottom line is, if you're really worried about like your carbon footprint, all I'm saying is that his carbon footprint is full of socks.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, I am reading here that it says he was widely known 1940s, 50s, and 60s, whereas the Jerry Lee Lewis that we are speaking of today, he was born in 1935. So he didn't get until like, I think it was like early 50s or something like that. I don't know. So it's in my notes somewhere.
Anybody who heard me railing on Jerry Lewis for ripping off Jerry Lee Lewis's name, just erase it. If we had a time machine, we'd go back. And I know what you're saying, Lauren, you have the ability to edit, but we don't do that on this show.
No,
we don't. We always tease about it, but then it's like, they get the full story. Again, Christy likes it raw.
At the end of the day, if the people really thought about it, if we edited all of this out, they'd be like, oof, that podcast's a bit dull. Very informative, but but a bit dull. You just need it. Yeah. The jokes off the top had to walk so that side note could run. I like that side note was in the same lady. And I also love it. For some reason, I'm like losing my voice based on nothing. I haven't been sleeping. It's fine. Nothing to be alarmed about. But the first thing, anytime I'm overtired, the first thing to go is my voice. Always, always. So anyway, I'm not sick is the point. But I love that also with the one time since in almost a year that we've been doing this podcast, the first time that my voice has just felt a little tired. This is the time I'm going, lady. I'm really pushing it. Wow. Makes sense. That's, oh gosh. That's just us in a nutshell. Yeah. What's the one thing we shouldn't do? Okay. So the only thing I'm going to do is exactly what you've just told me not to do. Think about how loud it would be inside that nutshell. It would smell like McDonald's and be a dream. Yep. It would be great. I also love that I'm just doing like a quick peek at my notes because I'm like, I did put side notes in, right? I printed off stuff that I was meaning to add into my notes, but forced myself to do it by writing it out by hand because the time I had to do it was at a football game and I didn't want to bring my laptop because it was rainy. So I was like, I'll just have to pen and paper this shit. And I did. And I think it's like you can tell the section where I get to where I do that because suddenly my side notes and my pizzazz are gone. But I can always bring a live pizzazz. You're naturally effervescent. You're like a sparkling water. Oh, look at you, lady. Hey, lady. Oh gosh. He won't mind if we use that bit. No. Also, truecrewmerch.com is where you can get the Halloween merch. It's on sale now until November 1st. Night shirts also, though, they're only on sale till September 30th. September 30th. So get them while they're hot. I was totally going to just let 30th go. September 30th.
No, I just loved because before you were like, this isn't an ad. And I was like, oh, it isn't an ad, but I should also just give them the info.
So that it's not an ad, but it can kind of be an ad.
I don't know if people are listening who don't follow us on social media who might be interested in merch. I know that feels like a demographic that probably doesn't exist. But if so, I just want them to have the info. That's all.
Of course, you're being informative, which, as the dear listeners know, that's what we do. It's our MO.
It's one of our MOs.
Yeah.
Yep.
Being charming as hell is the other one.
And hilarious. Oh God, I've got an energy in me and I don't know why. I don't know what's going on. I don't know. I'm swaying my shoulders. You know what I mean? I don't know what it is. I just feel like a rapscallion or something.
I could not be happier. There is a glow. I don't know. Maybe it's the pride over the new merch.
Yeah.
Maybe it's because, we're going to rage a lot in this episode.
I think that might be part of it.
Because when I read about this man, most are probably like, oh, there's nothing really true crime about that man. And it's like, you think that, and then you hear a single thing and you're like, I'll look into that. And then that just branches off to about 8 other things. And each of those things branches off into something else. And it's just like, this man has lived such a comfortable life that he shouldn't have. I'm sure Jerry Lee's people are going to come for me. I am not accusing him of anything.
Of course not.
I'm just going to lay out the facts as they were presented to me.
Exactly.
And let the people make their own decisions.
Yeah. Allegedly.
Oh, I do say allegedly a few times in there.
Yeah.
Just to be safe. Because when you have that level of money, I know you have lawyers. And when you're that age, you got nothing but time.
Sure. And I mean, there might be people in his life that have a good relationship with Papa Jerry Lee. I don't know who this is. Like, you have Blanche, you have Cookies. Like, you have all these other kind of like personas. Yeah. I don't know who this is over here right now. And I'm really excited to meet her. And I'm excited to, like, I guess maybe by the end of the show, we'll find out her name. I don't know.
But that is one of my favorite things, is naming them.
Yeah.
So I can't wait to see what feels right.
Yeah.
And I just want you to know, the second you say Papa, I assume you're going to say John's. And I don't know why, but I mean, hey, racist stuff is coming up later. So that segues nicely.
Have you seen the Papa John's TikToks? These are from like 2 years ago.
I have not.
Okay. Very quickly. So the Papa John, whatever his name is. Okay. He was doing this whole series of them where he was like showing off his house, which is like incredibly ostentatious. I'll find one and I'll send it to you. But there was this whole thing where he was referring to himself as Papa Bless. I don't know, in these videos. But then there was one where he inexplicably had like a weight, like a free weight, like he was like pumping iron. And the whole video is him just going, Papa Bless or Papa Flex.
No.
Yeah. And I was like, what is this content? Like, I mean, and it's well viewed.
Wow.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, people like what they like.
Listen, it's tough down here with, there's Chick-fil-A. There's been some things about that, and Papa John's. And what I'd like to say is I wish we could live in a world where we could all access whatever fast food we'd like, and we wouldn't have to have a moral quandary about it. That would be a nice place to live.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I think the second that Ronald McDonald is ever problematic, I'm just full walking into the sea.
Well, guess what? I'll be there with you. We're right there with you. Yep.
Yeah.
We're going under together. What you drinking over there?
I'm doing a Pombe.
Ah,
I haven't in a while, so I thought,
nice.
I should. And then of course I have to do a water because I've got almost 30 pages and they're packed. They're packed.
I can't wait.
So,
Well, listen, I have got a tangerine LaCroix or LaCroix. I mean, back home we would say LaCroix,
of course we would. Yeah.
but down here they say LaCroix. Delicious. And then I'd like to welcome back to the show one of our very special recurring guests, and that's Mr. Kimmy C. Kim Crawford.
Nice.
Yeah. And this glass is almost empty. I'm trying to limit myself because I will say that last week we recorded an episode of the show. That's how they go. They go away. Here are Coles. And then afterwards, we recorded a last call episode for our Patreon. You can learn more at patreon.com/truecrimeandcocktails. And I don't truthfully remember the end of it. It was into the white wine and El Vino did flow. And I, again, it got sloppy. Okay. So I'm limiting myself, or I was trying to one glass for the first half and one glass for the second half of this podcast. But I'm already like, oh, it's almost gone.
So sorry. We also, I mean, that day, in your defense, when we recorded a 2.5 hour episode and then an hour last call, before that we recorded another hour-long thing, which will come up in people's lives later on.
That's right. Yes.
So we did like a solid 5 to 6 hour record,
and we had tech issues too. So yes, what should have taken 5 hours probably took us 7. You're right.
Yeah.
And
it was it dragged it out, which with the booze it didn't help. But we also have barely drank in a while, so
I hadn't been drinking much. And then I was like, this feels right. Going back to my roots, and the roots being the vineyard. And so, and so that is the one thing though. There is a point in that last call episode where we had the biggest tech issue and it was like, it took forever to fix and whatever. So there is a point where it's like, oh, she's a little toasty. Okay. Everything's fine. Okay. She's a little bit drunk. She's completely obliterated. Like it's literally like, because there was so much time in between. Anyway, but that, you know what? That's the magic of True Crime and Cocktails.
Yeah.
Damn it.
Again, if we edit this stuff out, boring.
It's my judge's gavel, everybody.
I like it.
Makes no sense to you? Go back and listen to Death Row Fugitive, season 1. All right, let's get into this thing. I can't wait to rage against the machine. And in this case, the machine is Jerry Lee Lewis. So Jerry Lee Lewis is an American singer, songwriter, and pianist who is often described as one of the greatest entertainers of all time. On stage, he was known for his wild performances that earned him 14 #1 hits, 10 gold albums, and multiple Grammy Awards. But offstage, how you worded this is so good. But offstage, there was a sea of legal problems, drug addiction, violent outbursts, and even the shocking deaths of not one, but 2 of his wives. So what's the real story about Jerry Lee Lewis? Is he simply an exuberant musician who gets a bad rap? Or is his nickname Killer more accurate than we realized? Wowzers.
There's just so much. Again, this man is something else. Allegedly, Jerry Lee. Allegedly.
Uncle Jerry Lee.
So before I suggested this episode, my only knowledge of Jerry Lee Lewis was the 1989 Dennis Quaid Winona Ryder movie Great Balls of Fire, which I remember watching repeatedly as a child. And it was not for children.
Yeah.
But watching non-age appropriate shows was kind of my MO, apparently.
Yeah.
Again, Mannequin was my favorite movie when I was like 8.
And you also saw Silence of the Lambs at a very young age.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Mhm.
think if you want to describe my childhood, simply just the quote, too much too soon.
Fair enough.
Yeah. But while doing research for this episode, I rewatched the movie the other night, and it's not good. So I don't know how it held my attention as a child. And while that movie tells a part of his life story, there is so much that they left out. And when I came across a story about him a few months ago, I was immediately drawn in. And then I immediately, of course, pushed for this as an episode. And I know we're going to get to points when you're all thinking, okay, he's a shitty man. Where's the true crime? And to that I say, dear listeners, just trust me. This roller coaster of a journey will pay off. I promise you. And just to be clear, I am not accusing Jerry Lee of any crimes. I'm just presenting the facts so the dear people can decide for themselves. But honestly, the more I researched this man, the more I just fully screamed into the void. So if you're a fan of Jerry Lee Lewis as a musician, brace yourself, because after this, you might not be. Our story starts with the marriage of Elmo Kid Lewis and Mary Ethel Heron in 1929 in Louisiana. Elmo was 27 years old at the time, and Mary, who was known better as Mamie, was just 17. Ooh. I would like to clarify the 10-year age difference doesn't bother me. What does bother me is the fact that she was a teenager. I know times were different back then, but this choice definitely set a tone for this family. Mm-hmm. On November 11th, 1929, Elmo and Mamie welcomed their first son, Elmo Kid Lewis Jr., who was referred to as just Junior. Junior was described as a beautiful boy, obedient, and, quote, the good son.
Oh, geez.
An interesting way of putting that. He was also very musically inclined and began singing as a toddler. Elmo Sr. was a cotton farmer, but after poor harvests and the drought during the Great Depression, he briefly turned to selling homemade whiskey, which landed him in prison at least once before his second son was born. That second son was Jerry Lee Lewis, born September 29th, 1935 in Faraday, Louisiana. In the spring of 1938, Elmo Sr. was stopped at a federal roadblock. And while he was working as a whiskey runner at the time, on that day, he wasn't working, just merely driving. But because the authorities found a gallon of whiskey in Elmo's truck, he was sentenced to 5 years in jail.
Oh, wow.
On August 6, 1938, Mamie took her kids to visit her sister. 2-year-old Jerry played in the dirt near the house, while 9-year-old Junior played at the edge of the road. A drunk driver came out of nowhere, and Junior was struck and killed. When police arrested the driver, Mamie requested to not press charges and said that, quote, God will punish him. So the driver was uncuffed at the scene, and they literally told him just to walk. And he did.
Okay, that's wild.
Mm-hmm. Jerry Lee claims that at the age of 5, he walked by a piano and played Silent Night. His mother, Mamie, was convinced that Jerry Lee was a natural-born piano player. When Jerry Lee was 7, Elmo mortgaged the house to buy his son a $250 piano. Before long, Elmo and Mamie started to think the piano could help to solve their financial problems. Elmo and Mamie felt they needed to get their son to Memphis, Tennessee to meet with record executives. They made the 350-mile or 563-kilometer journey, selling 33 dozen eggs along the way to pay for it. Unfortunately, nothing came of their journey. And before I forget to mention, Elmo and Mamie would later have 2 daughters, Frankie Jean Lewis on October 27th, 1944, and Linda Gale Lewis on July 18th, 1947. So in the summer of 1949, Jerry Lee was given his first paid gig. Ford Motor Company brought their latest model to Faraday, Louisiana, where people could go pay to see it. And while they were there, they could hear a hillbilly band play on a small stage made from plywood and 2x4s. While listening to the band, Elmo Sr. felt Jerry Lee was better. So he went up to the stage and told the organizers that the real talent here was his son. Somehow, I don't know if he pushed his way on or if they were like, okay, we trust you. They let this kid play. A hat gets passed around through the crowd, and Jerry Lee earned about $14, which is equivalent to about $160 in 2021. After his first official paid gig, Jerry Lee decided to drop out of school as he just didn't see a purpose in it. Elmo put their piano on the back of their Ford and took Jerry Lee on the road. Around the time he turned 16, Jerry Lee's reputation as a piano player was spreading throughout Louisiana. And in 1951, a traveling evangelist named Reverend Jewel Barton came to Faraday to, quote, save the wicked. The Reverend hired Jerry Lee to play piano in an attempt to pack him in the church. But the Reverend did not arrive in town alone. He brought with him his 17-year-old daughter, Dorothy Barton. One look at her and Jerry Lee was smitten. The couple immediately started dating. And before you think, oh, that's so sweet, Jerry Lee described their initial relationship as 3 torturous months, but that he, quote, wanted more, needed more, and used all of his charm to get it.
Oh, God.
Jerry Lee told Dorothy that he loved her and that surely that was enough for them to finally have sex. But Dorothy said she was saving herself for her husband. So can you guess what Jerry Lee did? That's right, dear listeners. Jerry Lee proposed in order to get laid.
Ugh.
The couple married on February 21st, 1952. On the marriage license, Jerry Lee claimed to be a 21-year-old farmer. And after going through all of this to be able to have sex, after the wedding night, Jerry Lee said, quote, it wasn't what I thought it should be. I just thought it should be more. Another great quote from his first day as a married man, quote, it took me about 30 minutes to figure out that I'd made a mistake, that I got married too young. It had nothing to do with her. She kept up her end of the bargain.
Oh, God.
Almost every quote from this man fills me with a mixture of rage and disgust. But of course, they were too young at the time. They were only 16 and 17 years old. And I know I'm no marriage expert, but marrying someone just so you can sleep with them isn't exactly laying a foundation for a solid relationship. But after they were married, Dorothy started to plan out their life together because, you know, they were married and that's just kind of what you do. Jerry Lee claims he tried to be a dutiful husband. He worked as a truck driver and a carpenter's helper to pay the bills and playing piano at church. But after 2 months, he grew tired of the lifestyle. And by that lifestyle, I mean not cheating on his wife. So one night, he puts on a white sport coat and told his wife he's going out. His wife questioned where, and Jerry Lee lied and said he was going hunting. Dorothy begged him to stay, telling him she loved him. Even Jerry Lee's mother, Mamie, told him to stay and take care of his wife. But Jerry Lee left his wife and went straight to a bar where he could hear some music, play some music, and maybe consort with women. Here's another fun Jerry Lee quote. Playing in the clubs, you just do it. They just lay it on you. It was just about impossible to resist. And I just had to pick one out. It just kind of seemed like a dream.
Oh.
He also described the scene as, quote, women his age and older, all beautiful and all willing. And, quote, it was good as long as I wanted them.
Oh, my Lord.
He gets worse the older he gets.
No, I'm sure. I'm sure of it.
It's, yeah. Again, I promise we will get to the true crime, but we have to wade through the shit first.
Yeah.
It's a journey. We all like a journey.
Mm-hmm.
So poor Dorothy got the hint that Jerry Lee was no longer interested in their marriage, and she moved home to Monroe, Louisiana, while Jerry moved with a friend to New Orleans. Jerry Lee said that he was done with marriage and through with Dorothy, but didn't bother with the formality of getting an actual divorce. Although to me, he lied about his age on the marriage certificate, so wouldn't that make it void to begin with? I don't know. This is an issue I'm going to harp on for a while.
Yeah.
To me, it should be void, but either way, in his mind, them just not being together instantly means they're not married anymore because, turns out not just being a shit person, he's also dumb. No, I don't really mean that, except I do because I know about your life, Jerry, and I'm not a fan. God, she's spicy today. Anyhow, so at this point, Jerry is legally married, but not interested in actually being married. But his mother liked Dorothy, so she was pretty ticked at Jerry Lee for how he treated his wife. So, to appease his mother and possibly get back in her good graces, Jerry Lee enrolled himself at the Southwestern Bible Institute in, oh boy, Waxahachie, Texas? I apologize if I've missaid that because there were a lot of letters in there that I didn't know how they went together. 3 months into his first semester, the school put on a talent show. Jerry Lee played a standard "My God is Real," but did it in true Jerry Lee Lewis style of loud and fast. The president of the institute said that his reckless playing solicited an impure response from the students, so Jerry Lee was expelled. Jerry Lee then tried his hand at preaching, although that didn't last long. Then, to make ends meet, he took a job on commission as a door-to-door salesman with the Atlas Sewing Machine Company in 1953. The company sold their sewing machines on an installment plan, so there was no cost up front, just a contract that you would sign, agreeing to pay a small amount every month. Except Jerry Lee figured out a way how to sell a lot of sewing machines really quickly. He'd go to a house, tell the person they won a sewing machine, and they just need to pay $10 in tax. He'd then have them sign a paper saying it was to prove they've received their prize, but it was actually the contract. Then Jerry Lee and his partner would split the $10 and move on to the next unsuspecting victim. He said they sold more than 50 machines in a single day. And of course, when these unsuspecting people received their first bill, they just ignored it because they assumed it was some sort of a mistake. And then when the company reached out to them, they would say, well, the salesman told me I owned it free and clear. And then they would send people to these people's houses and be like, excuse me, but these people would answer the door with tough dogs and shotguns. So they got to keep their sewing machines. And the company then just fired Jerry Lee, but not before he made like $1,200 off of it. Jerry Lee says he now regrets the way he sold the machines, stating, quote, "Next time I won't leave the contract." So I feel like he really learned something.
Also, he regrets the way he sold the machines. No, he didn't sell them at all. He grifted people. He was a complete fraud. It's illegal. Yeah. Well, we've already got some crime going, so there you go.
Oh, and that's just like a teaspoon of water, and we're about to go to the Atlantic. Not just yet, but we'll get there. Oh gosh, it might be more than the Atlantic. We'll see. Yep. I didn't look up what was the biggest ocean.
Oh
yeah, I have no idea.
It could be either.
Oh, the people know geography isn't our thing.
It is not our thing. So this isn't a geography podcast, and we've never claimed it to be.
100%. Shortly after the sewing machine debacle, Jerry Lee and his partner were stopped at a country store to grab some gas when Jerry Lee noticed a big blue-barreled pistol in a glass case at the counter. He went back later that night and stole it. Jerry Lee was caught with it 2 weeks later and sent to jail. He said it was terrible because it was a tiny cell and it was crowded and the food was terrible. And the worst part, to quote Jerry Lee directly, quote, there weren't no women.
Oh boy. Okay.
Since it was his first offense, the judge sentenced Jerry Lee to 3 years probation. In early 1953, Jerry Lee met a woman named Jane Mitchum. Jane's boyfriend at the time felt threatened and said, quote, hold on now, that's my girlfriend. To which Jerry Lee responded, quote, she used to be your girlfriend. Jerry Lee and Jane got married September 15th, 1953, which is funny because he didn't get officially divorced from his first wife until October 8th, 1953. The legitimacy of their marriage has been questioned for years, although, again, I'm still questioning whether his first marriage was legal or not, as he lied about his age on his marriage license. But if that didn't matter, then he was still legally married to Dorothy when he married Jane, which means his marriage to Jane wasn't legal. Jerry Lee later said he lied on his first marriage license, and his second marriage was null and void because of his pre-existing marriage. So in his mind, quote, if you think about it, I ain't never really been married at that point. But it's
wow.
Like, but by your logic, if you're saying, well, I lied about my age, so that one's not real, well, that then automatically makes your second marriage real.
Right.
But in his mind, it's like, well, that one wasn't real, but I was married, so then the second one's not real. It's like that logic doesn't hold up. But again,
and
I can't be mad at him for this because I'll be mad at him for everything else.
I guess I would also just say, is it more important that it's not real in the eyes of the law, or is it more important that it's just not real to you, Jerry? I'm so sorry. My psychologist hat just flew onto my head. It just flew on.
Oh, it's gonna pretty much remain there now for the next like 2 hours.
Wait.
So it is said that the couple's marriage was a volatile one, as they were known for huge blowout fights that Jerry Lee claims included Jane trying to run him over with a car, pushing him down a flight of stairs, and throwing things at Jerry Lee, such as Coke bottles and Santa Claus figurines. He once said that she loved those Santa figurines, but not as much as she hated him, which I feel close to the same at this point, Jerry. His quote about their marriage was, we fought every night. Why? Because it was something to do. Jerry Lee has also once stated that he, quote, was raised to believe that if a man ain't got a family, then he ain't got nothing. So it should come as no surprise that less than a month into their marriage, on November 2nd, 1953, Jane gave birth to Jerry Lee Lewis Jr. Jerry said, quote, I loved my boy. He was the apple of my eye. So you see, something good came out of that, which brings me to a, wait a minute, what the hell side note. So Jerry Lee says that the birth of his son and namesake was the only good thing that came out of his second marriage. But the thing is, in March of 1956, Jane gave birth to Jerry Lee's second son, Ronnie Guy Lewis. But for some reason, Jerry Lee just will not accept that Ronnie is his son. To the point where in a biography that Jerry was interviewed for, doesn't even mention that Ronnie exists at all. No mention of him whatsoever. I found a picture of Jane with both sons when they were 3 and 18 months, respectively. And honestly, they're practically twins. Maybe I'm crazy, but I see a resemblance there. And yes, I know they could look alike because they have the same mother. But I also think this son, Ronnie, looks a lot like another son that Jerry Lee has years later with a different wife. So there is some Lewis genes in there. But I just assumed that Jerry Lee believed that Ronnie wasn't his child. Because I can't think of another reason why he would act like the kid didn't exist. But I will say, um, I find it amazing that he married a woman and a month after their marriage, she had a baby. And he just was like, well, obviously that's my son. And then years into their marriage, she has a baby. And he's like, nope. Doesn't
Like
exist.
how his parents had a son who was, quote, the golden child. And then he came along and it was like,
I see the psychologist hat is still right where I left it.
it never really comes off.
And it's part of what I love about you.
Thank you.
So Jerry Lee filed for divorce, charging Jane with misconduct, which I believe is an old-timey way of saying cheating. But Jane countercharged Jerry with bigamy since he was already married to Dorothy at the time of their wedding. The couple divorced December 1957, but not before Jerry Lee once again married another woman before his divorce was final.
My God.
And the fact that it happened once is crazy. The fact that it happened twice, gross. And yes, I know it could be argued that since Jerry was still legally married to his first wife when he married Jane, that would mean he was never legally married to Jane, although I still question the legitimacy of his first marriage. I'm just never letting that go. But Jerry Lee will never forget his second wife, Jane, especially because he named a mountain lion rug after her. I don't know why, but I've read interviews where Jerry Lee and his current wife laugh about the rug all the time. So yeah, they seem nice. Also a real mountain lion rug, huh?
Oh.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So after the rug, but long before the current wife, Jerry Lee's cousin, J.W. Brown, had seen Jerry Lee play piano and was so impressed that J.W. invited Jerry Lee to stay with him and his family in Coral Lake, Tennessee. The family consisted of J.W.'s wife, Lois, and their children, 2-year-old Rusty and 12-year-old Myra. J.W. took Jerry Lee to Sun Records, where they recorded his first single, Crazy Arms, on November 14th, 1956. J.W. was not only Jerry Lee's bass player, but also acted as his manager. Crazy Arms sold 300,000 copies, which sounds impressive, but apparently in the grand scheme of the record company, it's not. In February 1957, Jerry Lee's fame went international with the release of the single Whole Lotta Shakin' Going On, which reached number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 1 on Billboard magazine's R&B record charts. Sam Phillips, the owner of Sun Records, gave Jerry Lee his first royalty check for the song. It was $40,000, which is equivalent to nearly $380,000 in 2021. On October 8th, 1957, Jerry Lee recorded the song Great Balls of Fire for a movie called Jamboree. The single sold 1 million copies in its first 10 days in the United States. Some radio stations tried to ban Jerry Lee's songs, claiming that they were the devil's music, but that only made him that much more popular. Jerry Lee used to say, quote, "How can it be the devil's music? Satan didn't give me the talent. God gave me the talent."
Okay.
And yet, during an early recording at Sun Studios, Jerry Lee can be heard screaming at Sam Phillips, saying he has the devil inside him. So, Jerry, pick a lane. The spice is not going to go away.
The spice is nice. You know what I'm saying?
And I believe what the spice is cookies? I don't know. She's not a fan. While Jerry Lee's career took off, he started to be called Killer. And there was a rumor the name started because of Jerry Lee's wild antics on stage when performing, which leads me to a truth bomb side note.
Oh.
As a kid, Jerry Lee struggled in school, especially in the 6th grade or grade 6. When he got his final report card for the year, he tried to change all of his grades from F to A, but of course his parents noticed, although Elmo overreacted by beating his son with a belt. When Jerry Lee showed up for the first day of 7th grade, he learned he had not been moved up. from the 6th grade, but Jerry Lee decided to act like he should be there anyway. A teacher named Mr. Lancaster told Jerry Lee he'd failed the previous year and he'd have to go back to the 6th grade. Mr. Lancaster tried to physically carry Jerry Lee to the right classroom, but Jerry Lee took that moment to grab the teacher's tie and pull on it. And we're talking full strangling the teacher at this point. Jerry Lee was taken to the principal's office where he explained that he got heated because he wanted to stay in the 7th grade. Jerry Lee claims the principal said, quote, "I don't blame you a bit, but I got to suspend you for 2 weeks because we can't have you killing teachers." And when Jerry Lee left the school with another boy who'd been suspended for a separate incident, the boy said, quote, "See you later, killer." And killer has been Jerry Lee's nickname ever since. And I've shown them already, but I have a lot of negative feelings about Jerry Lee Lewis for things we will get into very shortly. But one of the things about him that irks me is how arrogant he is. For example, during the mid-1950s, Jerry Lee was touring with Chuck Berry, Marvin's cousin. That was a Back to the Future attempt at a joke, folks.
Yep.
The deal was they would alternate which one of them would close the show. But Jerry Lee said no one closes a show but Jerry Lee. So after being forced on stage first, Jerry Lee allegedly dumped lighter fluid on the piano and set it on fire at the end of his performance. He then walked off stage and told Chuck Berry, quote, "Follow that, boy."
Oh, God.
Mm-hmm. Another less horrific example is when he asked later in his life, who his musical heroes were when he was growing up. Jerry Lee said himself. The interviewer laughs it off and says, no, like, I mean, before you. But once again, Jerry Lee says himself. A Jerry quote from that specific interview, quote, "Well, I listened to other people. I liked them, but I could never find anybody that was better than me. That's why I always come back to my own sessions over and over again." Some may say, oh, he was just being confident. But to me, he was cocky and I don't care for it. And just in case you aren't convinced that Jerry Lee is not the best human, I give you I don't know when this happened, so I'm just sticking it here side note. So again, I could not find the exact year this happened, but I believe it was in the late 1950s. Allegedly, Jerry Lee was in Faraday visiting his parents and just driving his 1958 Buick around back roads going about 80 miles per hour, which is about 128 kilometers per hour for our metric friends. So this asshat is driving recklessly through back roads when a horse walked onto the road. Jerry Lee sees this and in that moment decides, oh, there's no possible way I could swerve out of the way in time. So he just slid down in the seat in front to brace for impact. He hit that poor animal, sending it over top of the car. The horse died, and Jerry Lee said his car was totaled. Jerry Lee doesn't recall the year it happened, but remembers that at the time he was sporting longer hair because, quote, "I shook my head, must have been like 3 hours, and I just kept getting glass, just kept falling out of my hair." When asked if the incident made him drive more carefully after that, Jerry Lee responded, quote, "No, if anything, I drove faster." And just in case you think, oh, Christy, don't be so hard on him, it was just an accident, I want to say when he talks about the incident, he admits to driving recklessly, but then blames the horse, saying, quote, "Wasn't supposed to be out, against the law, a horse to be out." He then suggested that most people would have sued to get their car fixed, but he didn't because, quote, "I don't sue nobody." So in honor of that poor horse, I'm going to say, fuck you, Jerry. That's where I'm at. Who sees an animal in the road and goes, oh, there's clearly no time, but I have time to shimmy down into the seat between the wheel and the seat so that that I can maybe be braced for impact. Who has time to swerve? Jerry?
Well, I mean, someone wearing a psychology hat could allege someone that would potentially have, I don't know, gone on to kill a human would start with an animal. But anyway, we're done. Again, we're not there.
Oh, interesting.
Hmm.
So one may say, allegedly, maybe he says, they didn't have time to swerve. And maybe we say, he did it on purpose.
I want to see what it feels like.
Allegedly.
Alleging it.
Again, as far as we know, it was an accident.
Mm-hmm.
So I know some of our dear listeners are probably thinking, oh, this guy sounds awful. But why is Christy just so spicy towards him? See, even in my notes, I knew I wasn't going to get through this without really being angry. Well, the question of why am I so spicy brings us to 1957 and Jerry Lee's next walk down the aisle. But before, I have to bring up this small piece because it will come in later. TV personality and comedian Steve Allen let Jerry Lee perform on his talk show on July 28th, 1957. It was a big deal because Steve gave Jerry Lee a shot when no one else would. Steve said he invited Jerry Lee on the show because he knew that Jerry Lee was incredibly talented. So at this point, Jerry Lee's career is on fire. Now, remember, right before this, in 1956, Jerry Lee was living with his cousin, J.W. Brown, as it was closer to Memphis, and J.W. believed in Jerry Lee's musical gift and wanted to help him advance his career. I also mentioned he was living in the same house at the time as J.W.'s 12-year-old daughter, Myra Gale Brown. Well, Jerry Lee said, quote, Myra was a 12-year-old kid when I got there. I paid no attention. We wasn't doing nothing at that time. But I got to watching her, and she was a grown woman all of a sudden. Yes, folks, for those who weren't aware of this particularly gross part of Jerry Lee Lewis's past, he started a relationship with his cousin Myra, which is just so many levels of awful. Somehow the least awful level is the fact that at the time he was still legally married to Jane. But in Jerry Lee's mind, when they separated and Jane was given custody of Jerry Lee Jr. and Ronnie, although he never mentions that part, Jerry Lee just assumed he was a legal single man. So on December 12th, 1957, 22-year-old Jerry Lee married 13-year-old Myra in a short ceremony at a small chapel in Hernando, Mississippi. They didn't tell Myra's parents as she was terrified of what they might say. Weeks later, a maid found the marriage license in a drawer and pointed it out to Myra's parents. Jerry Lee claims that his cousins were totally cool with it. But J.W. and Lois both claimed they were heartbroken, betrayed, and incensed. And if we may just briefly focus on the idea of someone marrying a child, I'd like to bring up an it runs in the family side note. Apparently, Jerry Lee's sister, Linda Gale, who has been married a total of 8 times so far in her life, entered into her first marriage at the age of 14.
Oh.
And their other sister, Frankie Jean, got married at 12.
Oh.
Some relatives said 12 was a bit early for a child to get married, but others said, it's not out of the ordinary in our family history. Yikes.
Yikes.
But then that got me wondering, are there celebrities who were publicly in a relationship with a minor?
Oh,
of course there were, because humans are basically garbage. Side note.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not so shockingly, there are a lot. So I don't have time to get into all of them, but I just want to mention the ones that I guess were like, I don't know, the worst to me.
Sure.
And some of them I did not know about. 25-year-old Rick Springfield. Dated Linda Blair when she was 15. 25-year-old Elvis Presley dated Priscilla at 14. 16-year-old Hilary Duff dated 29-year-old Joel Madden, who some of our dear listeners may remember from their emo teen years as a member of Good Charlotte. And to those listeners, I say, same. I only felt like I had to bring that up because I know some may be like, I have no idea who that is. Everyone else you mention is famous, but him. And it's like, tell that to him.
Yep.
Jerry Seinfeld was 39 when he started dating Shoshana Lonstein, who was a 17-year-old high school student at the time. They dated for 4 years. Don Johnson was 22 when he met 14-year-old Melanie Griffith. The couple moved in together when she turned 15. Doug Hutchinson was 51 when he married 16-year-old Courtney Stodden. I don't know if I'm saying this name correctly, but I hope not. Luc Besson was the director of the movie Fifth Element, was 31 years old when he started dating 15-year-old Maywin Labesco. Apparently, the couple met when she was 12, and Maywin gave birth to the couple's daughter at 16. Bassist for the Rolling Stones, Bill Wyman, started dating Mandy Smith when he was 47 and she was 13. R. Kelly was 27 when he married 15-year-old Aaliyah, which brings me to a true crime side note in a side note.
Thank you.
I think we all know that R. Kelly is a genuine piece of shit. He is currently facing multiple sex trafficking and racketeering charges dating back decades. R. Kelly is being accused of leading a criminal enterprise of managers, bodyguards, and other employees who allegedly helped him to recruit women and underage girls for sex and pornography. He is also accused of bribery, kidnapping, forced labor, producing child pornography, and knowingly infecting some accusers with a sexually transmitted disease. During the trial in August 2021, one of R. Kelly's accusers said that while they were out for dinner one night, R. Kelly allegedly said how much he likes young girls and then compared himself to Jerry Lee Lewis. R. Kelly allegedly said, quote, "He's a genius and I'm a genius. We should be allowed to do whatever we want. Look at what we give to the world." And to that I say, R. Kelly, giving the world the single hit Ignition does not give you a pass on being a terrible piece of shit. And even back to being angry at Jerry Lee, even if we ignore the fact that Myra was only 13 when they got married, which we won't because that's disgusting. There's still the fact that Myra and Jerry Lee were related. Which brings me to a celebrities who kept it all in the family side note. This list is thankfully shorter than the last one. Again, the last one was just a sprinkling of the ones that I found. But this list is shorter, especially if we ignore most of the royal families, because they were kind of known for keeping it in the royal bloodline pure, all that bullshit, which I am not agreeing with. I'm just saying it does happen. Like Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip were actually second cousins. Again, not the only royals who were related before their wedding, just an example. A quick list of famous men who married their cousins: Albert Einstein, H.G. Wells, Charles Darwin, Edgar Allan Poe, and piece of shit and all-around garbage troll Rudy Giuliani.
Garbage troll. I like that.
Cookies is always there.
He's like a treasure troll, but instead of having the jewel in his belly, it's just like an old can.
Yeah. I would also accept like a sock that has the green wavy smell lines,
Oh, yeah.
or like a cartoon cat, like the fishbone.
The fish bones. I was just going to say the fish bones.
It feels right.
Right.
So Jerry Lee married his 13-year-old cousin. And at first, Myra really struggled. When she was seen driving one of Jerry Lee's Cadillacs, she would get pulled over by the police as they assumed that she'd taken her parents' car out for a joyride, which makes me think that at the time, Myra probably looked like a child to people.
Mm-hmm.
But what did Jerry Lee think? After all, she was his wife. Well, when asked later in life, Jerry Lee said, quote, "Myra was not a baby girl. She was a woman. She looked like a grown woman, blossomed out and ready for plucking."
Oh,
please remember, dear people, that those are his words and not mine. And if disgust is your reaction, dear listeners, then you're not alone. Shortly after their wedding, Jerry Lee's single Great Balls of Fire was the best-selling single that Sun Records ever had. And on top of that, Elvis Presley had just been drafted into the military, so Jerry Lee was poised to become rock's biggest star. So Sun Records decided this is the time. We're going to take him international. Sam Phillips and other executives at Sun Records pleaded with Jerry Lee to leave Myra at home, but he refused to go anywhere without her. So Jerry Lee, Myra, and Jerry's entourage flew to England. However, on the way, an engine on their plane burst into flames, forcing the pilot to make an emergency landing in Ireland. The group boarded another flight and landed at Heathrow on May 22nd, 1958. Now, just a quick note that while Jerry Lee and Myra were first married, when Jerry Lee was legally married to someone else, they did marry again after he officially divorced from Jane. So Jerry and Myra were legally husband and wife when they got to England. And at the time, Jerry Lee was huge in England. So Heathrow was swarmed with fans and reporters. One of the reporters noticed Myra and asked her who she was. And because she was a child and didn't think anything of the question, she proudly said, "Well, I'm Jerry's wife." The reporter asked Jerry if it's true and then asked her age. Now, Jerry has always said he never found a problem with his wife being 13. But if that was true, then why did he try and cover and tell the press that Myra was 15? Well, being the press, they weren't buying it. So they did a bit of a deep dive and found out that the birth date on Myra's passport meant she was only 13. And then they found out that Myra was also Jerry Lee's cousin. Well, the Brits did not take kindly to this at all. When they arrived in England, the demand for tickets was so great, they had booked 27 appearances for Jerry Lee throughout England. However, after finding out about his child bride, the crowds at the shows were meager at best. And not only that, the few who did show up booed him while he was on stage. Newspaper headlines called Jerry Lee a baby snatcher and requested the public help to clear their gang out of town. After just 3 shows, the remainder of the performances were canceled, and the Mayfair Hotel where the entourage had been staying encouraged them to seek lodgings elsewhere. Jerry Lee's sister, Linda Gale, was quick to shame the Brits for how they reacted to Jerry Lee's marriage, saying, quote, I really like this quote, "Obviously, they never studied the sleeping habits of their own royalty. Half of the kings and queens of Europe were married to their first cousins. Nobody is just born looking like Prince Charles. It takes a lot of big noses in the family to get one like his." Oh, Linda.
Okay, Linda.
It's the thing. I like Linda's spice. I'll say that.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I ever really get into it, but Linda and Frankie are Jerry Lee's sisters. Just full devotion to that man their entire lives. Full devotion. And it's like, I guess because those are like the only women who don't care who you sleep with. Maybe, but like it's just they loved him so much. It's okay. So less than a week after they landed in the UK, Jerry Lee returned to the United States. However, news travels fast. He returned to the same cold shoulder he experienced abroad. Despite the numerous albums that he recorded after this, his career never fully recovered. Actor and musician Chris Christopherson said, quote, "I was in England when they ran him out of the country, and it really seemed unfair to me because he had no idea he was doing anything wrong. He went immediately from being a guy who made $10,000 a night to a guy who made $100 a night." And quickly to that, I say, I know that marrying young was no big deal in Jerry Lee's family, but I believe that if Jerry truly believed that he was doing nothing wrong, he wouldn't have lied about Myra's age when the reporter asked him. By aging her even just 2 years shows that Jerry Lee knew people wouldn't look favorably at their marriage if they knew the truth. And while over the next decade, Jerry Lee's fame and money dwindled down to almost nothing, the whole scandal somehow brought him and Myra closer together. Myra later said that it was like they were being attacked by the enemy, but they were able to hold strong because they had each other. Myra also commented that to this day, when people hear her name, they still call her Jerry Lee's child bride. She never escaped it. But during the years when Jerry Lee's career became a struggle, the couple welcomed a son, Steve Allen Lewis, on February 27th, 1959. The baby was named after the man who gave Jerry Lee his big television break in 1957. However, the happy family did not last long. On Easter Sunday, April 22nd, 1962, Myra was at home with 3-year-old Stevie. While Myra was cooking in the kitchen, she noticed Stevie was not around. The family went running around looking for him, and tragically, he was found at the bottom of the family swimming pool.
Oh.
Now, everyone grieves in their own way, and I can't even begin to imagine. But Jerry Lee took his son's death particularly hard. A few days later, he was meant to leave for England, and so many assumed he's just not going to go. I was also shocked that they would want him back. But Jerry Lee's longing for success was too big of a draw for him to say no. He said his son's death never took away his desire to be a star. Quote, "I had to go to England. It wasn't easy, but I had to go." Again, everyone grieves in their own way. He played a total of 22 shows around England between April 29th, which was a week after his son's death, and May 19th. I don't know how well he was received, but from the sounds of it, the public had somehow forgotten the whole marrying a teenager thing. On August 30th, 1963, Myra gave birth to the couple's daughter, Phoebe Allen Lewis. Years later, Phoebe would say that her dad probably would have stuck around longer if she'd been a boy.
Oh.
But Jerry Lee said she was his heart and she favored him, which is an interesting thing to say, Jerry.
Yeah.
I think Phoebe was alluding to the fact that Jerry Lee toured 200 days a year in the 1960s as his career started to look up when he transitioned from rock and roll to country music. On June 12, 1970, Jerry Lee was playing at the Pelican Club in Beaumont, Texas. Janis Joplin, who was from Port Arthur, Texas, came in to see the show. She'd been to a previous show of Jerry's in September 1969 and had met Jerry's bass player, whom Janis had taken a liking to. So Janis brings her sister Laura to the show and they go backstage, possibly looking for this bass player. And Jerry Lee was kind of a dick to her. Or more specifically, Jerry Lee said to Laura, quote, "You wouldn't be bad looking if you weren't trying to look like your sister."
Jesus.
Janis, of course, took great offense to this comment, so she hit Jerry Lee, who responded by punching Janis back and saying, quote, "If you're going to act like a man, I'm going to treat you like one." 1970 was also the year that Myra filed for divorce. Jerry Lee's response was that, quote, It was my fault. She caught me cheating. Myra never mentioned Jerry's cheating, but said she was filing for divorce because, quote, she had been subject to every type of physical and mental abuse imaginable.
Oh.
Myra said that one time Jerry arrived at 3 a.m., complained supper wasn't ready. Well, it's 3 a.m., Jerry. She was sleeping. He then hit Myra 3 times in the head. And when she raised her arms to try and block his blows, Jerry then beat her black and blue and told their 7-year-old daughter, quote, your mama's gone crazy. She's hitting herself in the face. Jerry Lee and Myra officially divorced in December 1970. Myra said that their 13 years of marriage, she counted 3 nights that she and Jerry spent at home alone. I would also like to point out that in the mid-1980s, Jerry Lee was asked if he'd ever hit one of his wives. He said, quote, I never hit a woman in my life. But numerous wives have accused him of abuse, not to mention the fact that he openly admitted to punching Janis Joplin. So maybe Jerry is just a liar trying to cover his tracks, allegedly.
Oh, this is just, I mean, every time I feel like it can't be a bigger mouthful of feces, it just is.
Yeah.
Well, listen, I mean, I'm excited because it's only downhill from here. Let's let's take a quick break, refill your drink, hit the can, and we're going to be right back with more about Jerry Lee Lewis on this episode of True Crime and Cocktails. Welcome back to this episode of True Crime and Cocktails. We're, of course, talking about Jerry Lee Lewis, not Hey Lady. I had to bring it back.
It doesn't matter how many times we say it. We have to keep saying that at the very least.
And I also like that my voice is getting more and more tired. Like it started at closer to the real one, like, hey, lady. And now it's like, hey, lady. Oh, I sound like when it's time to change. Well, then it's time to change. For the young listeners, that's from a show called The Brady Bunch.
Which was also before our time.
It was.
Yeah. But
it was.
We're still down. We're still
hip. We're still with it.
Oh God, what's the quote? I'm down. I'm jiggy. And you're not going out and getting dope with, or you're not going out with some boy. I don't care how dope his ride is.
Yep.
I think. I don't know.
All those Dawson's River kids sleeping in each other's beds
is my favorite quote from that
good
movie.
We're quoting 10 Things I Hate About You. Also for the young listeners of the podcast who also may not. There was a young actor named Heath Ledger in that film. God, we could keep going down the rabbit hole of trying to educate. Shout out to Heath Ledger.
I always like A Knight's Tale. Of course I liked it. Him as Joker. Say what you will. There's no one better.
I agree. Yep.
So well done.
Yep.
But him in 10 Things I Hate About You, it was my introduction. It was certainly Blanche's introduction.
Yeah.
And Blanche hasn't forgotten.
I'm going to tell you a little something real quick.
Yeah.
There are 3 scenes that Lauren Ash, as a youth, rewound and rewatched and rewound and rewatched and rewound and rewatched.
Sure.
One, as everybody knows, is the end of Speed when he doesn't leave her.
Of course.
Again, hashtag abandonment issues. Number 2 is in 10 Things I Hate About You, when Heath Ledger's character serenades Julia Stiles, you're just too good to be true, in the stands. Oh, I must have rewound and rewatched that a million times.
Yeah.
The third.
Yeah.
This is the bogey that I don't think anyone saw coming. Not even you.
Oh,
I want to give you a guess, but I feel like this could go on forever. Take a guess.
A guess of a specific moment in a movie.
I'm trying to channel it to you.
I know. Oh, see, no, you didn't like Romeo and Juliet. Not in the way I did.
Yeah.
Oh God. I mean, I know you were Train Spotting, and I know you were Hardcore Logo, but I just don't know if there was a specific scene.
No, because
But
we're talking
those
about
scenes, we're
romance
talking
here.
romantic.
Yes.
So, romance in the 90s.
How about this? I'll give you the first 2 lines.
Oh,
I love you, and not in a friendly way. Though we're great friends.
although you'll say we're great friends.
Yes.
And not in a misplaced puppy dog way, although I'm sure that's what you'll call it.
Yep.
And I don't remember the rest of that, but I know it's, which I don't need a painting of birds, although I do appreciate it to remind me of.
Yep.
Chasing Amy.
Thank you very much.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I memorized that.
So did I.
Did I.
Yep.
Misplaced puppy dog way, although I'm sure that's what you'll call it.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
I haven't watched
God.
that movie in probably, honest to God, probably 20 years. Put it on the list.
Yeah.
Put it on the list.
Oh, yeah.
I bet you if we watched it now, we'd be like, oh God.
Probably, but I am also convinced my love of that and my love of him in that is why I'm so happy to have him and J-Lo back together.
We're going to have a full conversation about that later, because I'm in the same boat. And it's
in my brain,
yep.
He's like that in real life.
I know he's not. I'm sure he's not. Oh, but let's get back into somebody who is a certified POS in real life. And that's, of course, Jerry Lee Lewis. We left off. He just divorced his 13-year-old child bride after, some time together. She wasn't 13 at the time of their divorce, but she was at the time of their marriage. Also his cousin. Yep. Gross, awful, horrifying. What's next?
Well, 1970 was just like a harsh year, I guess, for Jerry, because he had that divorce. And then he got another blow just months later when his mother, Mamie, died, April 21st, 1971. Mamie was Jerry Lee's rock, and he never truly recovered from her death. But he was still okay being a giant pile of shit. Allegedly. 1971 also brought this incredibly random thing into Jerry's life. Apparently, Jerry Lee cut some music for the astronauts on the Apollo 14 mission, which was the third NASA mission to successfully land humans on the moon, which sounds cool. But the idea of being trapped in space and the only sound is Jerry Lee Lewis sounds more like a nightmare to me. And that's maybe because I have this super big bias that I've grown towards him. The more interviews of his that I've read and watched, he's not an easy person to like.
Yeah.
So there's that. Also in 1971, Jerry Lee met 29-year-old Jaren Elizabeth Gunn Pate, a secretary in the Memphis Sheriff's Department. And Jaren discovered she was pregnant. Jerry refused to marry her, which is completely out of character for him. But he but he changed his mind when her brothers showed up at his house with weapons. So in October 1971, Jerry Lee and Jaren were married. And for a nice change, Jerry was actually legally divorced before the wedding. The couple allegedly separated 2 weeks later and never lived under the same roof again. Jaren moved to a house in Collierville, Tennessee that Jerry had paid for. Jerry Lee said he didn't want to live with Jaren, but that he also didn't want to go through a divorce. His main reason for that being he just didn't have anyone else he wanted to marry. A Nashville producer once put his psychologist hat on and said that Jerry Lee was, quote, very insecure. The only thing he is secure with is his music. He can play Bach, Beethoven. It is God-given, but he runs from everything else. He is terrified of being alone. Jerry Lee said that he married Jaren because she was pregnant, although he claims the baby wasn't his. 5 months after their wedding, Jaren gave birth to Lori Lee Lewis, and listed Jerry as the father on the birth certificate. He refuses to talk about it in public, but he does not acknowledge Lori as his daughter at all. In a book dedication, Jerry Lee referenced Phoebe as his only daughter.
Oh, God.
Like specifically, it was like to my sons, whatever, but to Phoebe, my only daughter, which feels like a real jab, you know?
Yeah.
So for those keeping track at home, at this point, Jerry Lee had 5 children, but he was only acknowledging 3 of them.
Wow.
But tragedy would once again strike the Lewis family. In 1973, Jerry Lee Lewis Jr. was touring with his father as the band's drummer. During a break from tour on November 13th, 1973, Jr. was driving in Mississippi when investigators believe he took a curve on the Holly Springs Highway and struck the abutment of the bridge. This caused Jr. to lose control of the vehicle, which flipped, breaking his neck. He was killed instantly. He had just turned 19 years old.
Oh.
At this point, Jerry said, quote, "The loss of my mother and 2 sons got to me. I was drinking heavy. I needed a 5th of tequila just to sober up." He also added, quote, "I couldn't cut a record. It wasn't the marriages that brought me down. It was just the passing of the caskets." And again, I can't imagine the death of 1 child, let alone 2. But it does not excuse him for being garbage for before that or since.
No.
And I know that I've given Jerry a lot of shit in this episode, and spoiler alert, there's more to come. But I want it to be said, I do not judge that man based on how he reacted to the death of his children. Again, I can't imagine being in that situation. So I think you probably just do whatever you need to get through it. So when I say that he increased his drinking and his amphetamines use, it's not with judgment. It's just a fact. But Jerry has also allegedly been taking pills since the start of his career. Some claim he used to walk around with a pocket full of pills all the time, and he'd allegedly just pop them like candy. At this point, Jerry's life turned into one legal trouble after another. In March 1975, a waitress at Bad Bob's Lounge in Memphis claimed that Jerry Lee attacked her with a fiddle bow. He was convicted of assault and battery and fined $25. The waitress took the bow from Jerry Lee and broke it, and for that was charged with malicious mischief and fined $15. He claims he doesn't recall attacking anyone, but said that if he did hit someone with a fiddle bow, it was because they either interrupted him during a song or because they made him mad, which is just basically saying, if I did hit someone, it was their fault.
Yeah.
And the legal troubles didn't stop there. In September 1976, Jerry Lee was celebrating his 41st birthday at the house in Collierville that he had originally purchased for Jaren. Even though she had tried to file for separation twice, they were still married at this point. Although they still weren't living together, but Jerry said that at this point he was, quote, unconsolable drinking. Those were his exact words, not mine. But that level of drunkenness feels like, I don't know, the best time to handle a weapon. So for some reason, someone handed Jerry a gun, and he claims he hit a Coke bottle and it flew into 1,000 pieces. And then his bass player, Norman Butch Owens, screamed he'd been shot in the chest. Jerry Lee not only claims that the gun was already cocked when it was handed to him, but he also refuses to admit that Butch was actually shot, instead claiming, oh, he just got hit with some of the glass from the Coke bottle. And it's like, if you were that drunk, there's no way that your accuracy was so good you hit a bottle.
Well, hold on a second here.
Yeah.
So we know that this man has been shot. Like
Yes.
Even knowing that it's like he's gotten medical attention, he's been shot. Jerry Lee Lewis says, no, it wasn't a bullet, it was glass.
Yep.
That is a level of gaslighting that this psychologist has never seen. Wow. Okay. All right.
The incident was labeled as an accident, and Jerry Lee was charged with discharging a firearm within city limits. When Jerry was asked about the incident, he said, quote, "I just know it took a couple of days for him to talk right." Now, we all know Jerry has a bit of a temper. So do we really believe that this shot was an accident? And I know I don't know Jerry personally, but drunkenly shooting someone sounds absolutely like something Jerry would do, especially if Butch said or did something that Jerry didn't like. Please note, I am not blaming Butch for this. Butch also claims that after he was shot, Jerry's wife, Jaren, was screaming at him for getting blood on their white shag carpet. Butch sued Jerry Lee, claiming that just before the shot, Jerry Lee said, quote, "Butch, look down the barrel of this."
Oh my God.
Butch was awarded $50,000, which is almost $240,000 in 2021. And now at this point, almost everyone is suing Jerry Lee. He was being sued for broken contracts. Bandmates quit on him and then sued him for back wages. Myra sued him as she felt Jerry was not meeting the commitments of their divorce. On November 22nd, 1976, Jerry and Jaren were driving around Collierville in his Rolls Royce when Jerry managed to flip the car. Neither were badly hurt, but Jerry Lee was charged with driving while intoxicated and reckless driving. He was arrested but bailed out later that day. The press, of course, hounded him when he was released, and Jerry lashed out at them, claiming that they were hard on him, but always gave Elvis a pass. And I know that Elvis wasn't the best human being either, but he was better than you, Jerry, and I hope that burns you. Again, I just want to take all of his wives and just tell them, like, I just want to stand in a circle with them, all of us holding hands, saying, "You deserve so much better than that man."
Yeah. Wow.
Neither here nor there. So on the next day, November 23rd, Jerry claims that Elvis reached out to him and invited him to Graceland. And according to Harold Lloyd, Elvis's cousin, who was also the guard at the front gate of Graceland, when Jerry showed up, he was hammered. And not only that, he was also driving his brand new Lincoln, which he got after destroying the Rolls Royce the day before. So Jerry pulls up in his Lincoln, but didn't stop in time. So he ended up slamming into the iron gates. Jerry Lee admitted he was drunk that night, but that he had an empty bottle of champagne. He tried to throw it out the car window, except he didn't actually roll the window down first. So throwing the bottle at it just shattered the window and sent glass flying everywhere, which cut Jerry's face. Jerry said, quote, "I don't know what the problem was, except I was drunk." The guard claims that Jerry had a gun and demanded to see Elvis. Jerry, of course, claims the gun, which he initially placed on the dashboard, had fallen to the floor after the vehicle hit the gates. Elvis, who was watching the whole scene unfold on the security cameras, called the guards and told them to call the police. When they arrived, they asked Elvis what he wanted done, and Elvis said, quote, "Lock him up." Jerry claims he was really hurt by the thought that Elvis would fear him. He said the idea of him ever doing any harm to Elvis was laughable because they were friends. But the police claim when they arrived on scene, Jerry was sitting in his car with the gun cocked and loaded, resting on his knee. They also claim Jerry was out of his mind and refused to leave until he spoke with Elvis. Police also found out that the gun wasn't registered, and Jerry Lee said the reason was he didn't have a permit for the gun because it was a gift from a policeman.
Oh, stop it.
But just imagine showing up to a celebrity's house so drunk that you slam into the front gate with your car. Then you get out and your face is all bloody and you're screaming about wanting to see the biggest celebrity in the country, and you have a gun. I mean, of course, the police are going to get involved. And did you hear that, Jerry? I said Elvis was bigger than you. Again, Jerry's not going to hear this. I just want that to hurt. Elvis was also by far way more attractive. Again, I just want to hurt him.
I like that you're going for the jugular. I like it a lot. And for the record, It is really something to show up at a celebrity's home. I usually leave celebrities' homes drunk. Hello, good night, goodbye, and hello.
At least you don't take a gun with you.
I don't own a gun.
It's, again, you want to own a gun? Own a gun.
Yep.
Don't take it somewhere when you're hammered and you're like, cool, and wave it around and demand to see the fucking king of rock and roll. You hear me, Jerry? Wasn't your title, was it? Again. Here's the thing.
This is becoming a call out.
Here's the thing.
This is becoming like a two and a half hour long diss track, which I love.
Yeah, it is. Because, dear listeners, in all of this research, I've learned he will not say it, but there is a definite, obvious, deep, deep jealousy that Elvis had the fame and had the career, and Jerry is just chasing that dream that he just never got to. And I'm happy that he didn't get there. And that's where I'm at. I may regret being as spicy as I get about Jerry.
I won't.
The thing about him specifically that bugs me the most is how badly he treats women from like his entire life, and he's never really had any sort of punishment for it. Like, just every wife is like, oh, there was abuse.
Right.
And it's just, he's just so gross. So incredibly gross.
Yeah.
So the 70s were a period where alcohol and pills really took over Jerry Lee's life. He'd been known for abusing pills since the start of his career. I've already said this part. Good Lord, Christy. We are going there because I got a little distracted with talking about Elvis, and how could I not? We've seen him. Come on. Again, I know Elvis is also problematic, but not as bad as this. Anyhow, so at some point in the early 70s, Jerry Lee purchased a ranch in Nesbitt, Mississippi, which is about 20 miles or 32 kilometers outside of Memphis. The ranch sits on 35 acres overlooking a lake and features a swimming pool shaped like a grand piano. Jerry Lee lovingly referred to it as the Lewis Ranch. Unfortunately, due to the wild parties that he was known for throwing and his even wilder personal antics, it came to be known as Disgraceland.
Oh boy.
Today, the ranch is used as a Jerry Lee Lewis museum and was run by Jerry's sister Frankie until her death in 2016. And I believe it's currently run by Jerry Lee III, but I could be wrong about that. I'm going to be honest. I don't give a shit who runs it now because I'm just fired up now. That's just where I'm at. So while we're talking about the 70s, we have to mention Jerry Lee's problems with the Internal Revenue Service.
Oh,
in
dear.
1979, the IRS seized property from Jerry to compensate for his $274,000 debt, which is equivalent to just over $1 million in 2021. The property included more than 60 items, including several automobiles, a tractor, 5 motorcycles, jewelry, musical instruments, home entertainment equipment, and firearms. In 1980, an auction of these items was held, but only 150 bidders showed up, and the auction only raised about $91,000. But during the initial search and seizure, the IRS also turned up cocaine and marijuana. The DeSoto County authorities bargained it down to a simple marijuana misdemeanor. Jerry didn't bother to show up in court, and the problem just magically went away after he paid a $2,000 fine.
Mm-hmm.
The intense stress of his IRS problems, coupled with 15 years of intense drug and alcohol binging, started to take a physical toll on Jerry. At one point, he claimed, quote, "I never drank that much." But then years later, he said, quote, "I drank enough whiskey to lift any ship off the ground, drank enough beer for a whole damn town." Well, if he did drink that much, it's no wonder that he suffered numerous ulcers. On June 30th, 1981, Jerry Lee was rushed to the hospital after complaining of stomach pains and coughing up blood. It turns out he had a tear in the lining of his stomach. He spent 2 months in the hospital after undergoing surgery to repair this 2-inch tear. He was put on a respirator and was in critical condition. Following the surgery, Jerry Lee allegedly got addicted to painkillers, which led doctors to prescribing him methadone. This will be important later, but don't worry, I'll remind you about it when the time is right. He would end up back in the hospital in 1984 with perforated ulcers. That time, doctors cut away a third of his stomach.
Oh, dear.
Yeah. But Jerry's health struggles aside, his stress was far from over. A series of petitions began in spring of 1979 with Jerry Lee filing for divorce from Jaron. Jerry Lee claimed they hadn't lived together as husband and wife since October of 1971. Jaron countersued, accusing Jerry Lee of years of cruelty and drunkenness. Jaron said that Jerry Lee was extremely violent, especially when he was intoxicated. She accused him of choking her, beating her, knocking her down the stairs, and once even threatening her life. She sued Jerry for abandonment, adultery, habitual drunkenness, and use of narcotic drugs. Jaron also requested a restraining order after she asked Jerry for financial assistance for herself and their child, and Jerry told her, quote, "Don't worry about support. You're not going to be around very long anyway, and if you don't get off my back and leave me alone, you'll end up at the bottom of a lake with chains on you."
Oh, my God.
Jerry's manager, J.W. Whitten, said not to worry. Jerry, quote, always says crazy stuff like that. The messy legal battle between Jerry Lee and Jaron dragged out, and a final court date was set for the end of June 1982. But before that court date could happen, Jaron drowned. On June 9th, 1982, Jaron was sunbathing at her friend Millie LeBrum's house in Collierville, Tennessee. Millie couldn't see Jaron, so she sent her son to go check on her. He found Jaron in their above-ground swimming pool. The Shelby County medical examiner ruled Jaron's death as accidental and said no foul play was involved. And with that being said, I'd like to see the autopsy report before I agree with that statement. And remember that Jaron had a daughter, Lori, just 5 months after marrying Jerry, and how he refused to accept the child as his own? Well, even after Jaron's death, Jerry Lee refused to step up and still to this day claims that is not his child. But don't worry about Jerry Lee being lonely. During the last few years of his fourth marriage, he was living with Mary Kathy Jones from 1980 to 1983, although I don't think he ever attempted to marry her. Mary would later claim that Jerry was physically abusive to her throughout their relationship, including a time he broke her nose because she disagreed with him over something.
Jesus.
But with his fourth wife gone, Jerry Lee was once again free to marry. After his relationship with Mary Jones ended in early 1983, 47-year-old Jerry Lee married 25-year-old Sean Michelle Stevens on June 7th, 1983. And since his career still hadn't recovered from the England tour in 1958, Jerry and Sean let the National Enquirer take photos of the wedding, which took place on the patio at Lewis Ranch. J.W. Whitten, Jerry Lee's manager at the time, said they had to use a justice of the peace for the ceremony as they couldn't find a preacher, although J.W. said that he did find one, quote, but he was black and Jerry might not have liked that.
Oh, God.
Jerry Lee supposedly met Sean for the first time in 1981 when he had a week of performances at a hotel nightclub where Sean worked as a waitress. Pam, who was dating Jerry's manager at the time, introduced them saying, quote, I thought she was flexible enough to understand his moods, which is ominous at best. I've also read time and time again that Jerry, quote, demanded uncompromising devotion from women. Cheats on them, but they have to be just, yep. Allegedly, Jerry and Sean saw each other off and on, including when Jerry took Sean with him during a European tour. And then Jerry started to hound Sean about being with him and told her he wanted to marry her and that she had to decide when he got back from a tour in the spring of 1983. When talking to her sister Shelley about it, Sean said, quote, "There's no way I'm having kids with that old creep. I'm just going to stay married for as long as I can. Then I'm getting the hell out." So I'm not sure either of them were super jazzed about this union. On their actual wedding day, they realized they didn't follow the rules regarding marriage licenses in Mississippi. At the time, the law stated that the couple needed to wait 3 days after getting the license before they could officially marry, and they were also required to submit a blood test. We have talked about that specifically on the show before, and some of our international listeners had commented because they weren't sure about that. And while I don't know about the laws about marriage in certain states and what they are now, back then, couples were required to get a blood test before they could legally get married. Apparently, the test was specifically for syphilis. And if either person tested positive, the county wouldn't grant them a marriage license until it had been treated. But they didn't do a blood test or wait the 3 days. So Jerry's manager called someone that he knew and made it so that the wedding could take place. The manager proudly said, quote, "I made a phone call, somebody I knew down there. In the business, it's called juice," which is the douchiest thing I have ever heard.
Yeah, no thanks.
So Sean's mother claimed that on the morning of the wedding, she saw Jerry Lee in a bedroom with a doctor who had laid out numerous pills. The doctor in question was Dr. George Nicolopoulos. Nicolopoulos. It doesn't even matter anymore. This doctor was briefly Elvis Presley's personal physician, especially around the time that Elvis really spiraled down. This doctor also lost his medical license in 1980 for overprescribing addictive drugs. The doctor would later testify that he frequently wrote narcotics prescriptions for Jerry. After the wedding, Jerry and Sean argued a lot. At this point, Jerry was fully addicted to painkillers. Now, when they ask about their life together, Jerry talks about Sean's struggle with pills and says, quote, "But she done it to herself," claiming he never forced her to take anything. Then he adds quickly, "Well, I never hurt her," which seems like a random thing to add when simply just being asked about their marriage. Or that is until you learn that their maid found Sean dead in a guest bedroom of the couple's home, August 24th, 1983. They'd been married 77 days.
Okay.
The DeSoto County Sheriff said that a preliminary autopsy found that the cause of death was pulmonary edema or a fluid buildup in the lungs, which is often seen with pneumonia or a heart condition. A full autopsy was completed by Dr. Jerry Francisco, who also did the autopsies of Martin Luther King Jr. and Elvis Presley. I promise I haven't meant to bring up Elvis as much as I have, but some of it was just naturally. Some of it was spite. Dr. Francisco claims he found methadone in Sean's system at 10 times the normal dose. He also claimed he found no evidence that the dosage was forced into the victim's mouth or throat. A DeSoto County prosecutor claims that a full investigation of the case was done and that investigators concluded that nothing pointed to homicide. A grand jury reviewed the case and found no grounds for indictment. Sean's family were unwilling to accept that Sean's death was an overdose, so they hired a private attorney to investigate her death. Their belief is that Sean would still be alive today if she hadn't met Jerry Lee. So let's see if we agree. The ambulance was made aware of an unconscious party at the Jerry Lee Lewis residence. When the first ambulance arrived, the housekeeper, Lottie Jackson, led first responder Sonny Daniels to the guest room. Sonny noted that the room was orderly and the victim was in bed, turned slightly away from the wall with the covers pulled up to her neck. The bed did not appear to have been slept in. When checking the victim's vitals, Sonny noticed the body was warm, but there seemed to be no sign of a pulse or any breathing, and the eyes were dilated. A second ambulance arrived and Matthew Snyder entered the scene. Matthew noted, quote, angry little bruises, like someone grabbed her hard on the victim's forearms and a little stain of dried blood on the web of her hand. Lottie knocked on Jerry Lee's bedroom door, and within seconds, he burst into the room in a robe. So if he was supposedly sleeping at the time, he would have been sleeping in a robe, I guess, because he wouldn't have had time to put it on. Sonny noted 2 bright red scratches on the back of Jerry's hand from his wrist to his knuckles. He described the marks as similar to a cat scratch. Deputy Sheriff Jack McCauley happened to be patrolling in the area when he saw an ambulance and followed it to the house. I would like to add that I find it super convenient that the deputy was in the area at the time, as his regular patrol area was miles away. He also never gave an explanation as to why he was in the area at the time, so that's interesting. Also, something about him I could not confirm. Some say he lived in this massive, like $200,000 house, even though the annual salary for a deputy sheriff at the time was $12,000 a year. So that's also interesting. Another reason why I don't trust this deputy. Apparently, he was the right-hand man of James Albert Riley, who was campaigning for sheriff at the time. And who was the largest single contributor to Riley's campaign? Jerry Lee Lewis. His most recent payment of $500 was made the day before Sean died. Now, to be fair, it is possible that Jerry didn't know about the campaign contributions, as his manager was the one who wrote the checks. But one thing I will point out, the record of those campaign donations have since disappeared from courthouse files. So Deputy McCauley said he arrived at the house just after the ambulance around 12:30 p.m. And yet the official police report said the ambulance arrived at 12:52 p.m. The deputy claims that Jerry Lee's speech was heavily slurred, but that overall he seemed coherent and alert. The deputy's report stated that an investigator was called to the house as there was no visible cause of death, and Jerry's robe appeared to contain bloodstains, and he had a cut on his wrist. His report also states that at 1:51 p.m., Jerry's manager arrived, and that Jerry said they needed to, quote, find out who killed, how she died, so that funeral arrangements could be made.
Oh, boy.
But something not in the deputy's report, the fact that when the deputy first arrived, he spoke alone with Jerry in Jerry's den for over an hour. He also never filed a report regarding what they said in that time. And that brings me to a section that I'm just simply calling other things not in the deputy's report. Blood on Sean's hair, blood on Sean's clothing and bra that were found in another room, blood on a lamp, a towel, and the bedding, blood on Jerry's robe and slippers, blood on a door and a spot on the carpet, bloody gauze on a cabinet in the billiard room, dirt on Sean's body, bruises on Sean's arms with fingernail indentations above them, bruises on Sean's upper right thigh, neck discoloration, broken fingernails with what appeared to be dried blood underneath, and just the simple fact that the body had clearly been moved. The sheriff released a statement saying that Jerry Lee had cut his finger on some glass, which they said explains the blood on Sean's hand. And the bruises on her body? Oh, they were just superficial. You know, the kind anybody might have. But let's look at the scene ourselves. Sean was found in the bed of the guest room with the blankets pulled up to her neck. But the first responders were both adamant that the bed looked as though it hadn't been slept in. The rest of the room was spotless, and there was nothing near the body. The master bedroom had a tray with dirty dishes that had steak bones and leftover vegetables on it. Neither the food nor the tray was collected for any sort of analysis. There was also broken glass on the floor, but no pieces large enough that investigators could figure out what it came from. There was also a 9mm pistol on the table by the bed and bullet holes in the wall across from it. The sheriff released a statement saying that their search of the house turned up no non-prescription drugs and no unusual amounts of prescription medications. And yet, techs at the crime lab spent days working to collect all of the drugs they found at the house, enough drugs to fill 3 single-spaced pages on their crime lab list, and at least one hypodermic needle was found, but the analysis wasn't even started by the time the grand jury ended. Shortly after, Jerry went out to his favorite club, Hernando's Hideaway, asking for needles because, quote, goddamn cops cleaned me out. So what can we say about the body? Well, a coroner needed to be brought in to handle the autopsy. DeSoto County had a $260 budget for autopsies, but Jerry Lee said he wanted the best. So he chose Dr. Jerry Francisco to do the autopsy, even though his fee was $2,800. But Jerry was happy to pay because he heard Dr. Francisco was the best in the county and he wanted the best. The funny thing about Jerry paying for the autopsy himself, it meant that the report would be a private report and then wouldn't therefore be placed in public record. But I'm sure that had nothing to do with the decision. Sean's mother, Janice Kleinhaus, wanted to protest the autopsy, but when she called the coroner's office, she was told it was too late. The autopsy was already underway. However, the autopsy wasn't scheduled until the day after her call. And when this was later pointed out, investigators said, well, whoever she spoke to must have just misspoken. Now, the thing about the report is that Dr. Francisco refused to release the contents of the report at the family's request. But it wasn't the family's request, it was Jerry's request. Because after all, he was the one who paid for the private autopsy. And since the report was never officially released, of course, I have not seen it personally, but I found an article written by an investigative journalist back in like 1983, 1984, or something like that. And it gives the impression that this man has seen this report. I don't know how, but everything that he talks about seems to be backed up by people who were there, specifically the first responders. So I'm going to just take a leap that this guy is accurate. But according to this source, some pretty obvious things were left out of this private autopsy, such as any bruises of any kind, blood stains. There was no mention of Sean's fingernails and no analysis of the possible blood that was found underneath her fingernails. In the end, Dr. Francisco's report said the cause of death was pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs, due to causes unknown. But he did say that fluid in the lungs is a classic sign of overdose of methadone, but he couldn't determine whether it was suicide or an accident. And once the good doctor said that, all the newspaper headlines were, Jerry Lee's wife killed herself. And I'm not convinced of that at all. But of course, the autopsy report stated that there was no sign of foul play, except for all of the ones they ignored.
Yeah.
And while Dr. Francisco was quick to tell people Sean died of a methadone overdose, there is no mention in his autopsy report of any residue of the tablets that Sean supposedly ingested. He claimed Sean's levels were 10 times higher than normal. The thing about the pills, if they were 10 milligram tablets, Sean would have needed to take 10 to 20 of them to get to the amount in her system. Jerry Lee had an old prescription for methadone from back when he had the stomach surgery years before. But that prescription was for 5 milligram tablets, which means Sean would have needed to take 20 to 40 of them. But again, the autopsy made no mention of pill residue. So could the methadone have gotten into her system another way? It's more than possible. After all, methadone is soluble in liquid. But again, the food and trays that were in the master bedroom were not ever tested in any way. So how else could it have possibly gotten into her system? I mean, there is this one thing that made it onto the autopsy report. Quote, 2 small abrasions on the anterior aspect of the right arm, adjacent to the armpit, measuring 3 millimeters in diameter. Someone who also noticed this was the funeral director, who said, quote, it looked like a hypodermic needle mark inside of her right arm under the armpit, a hypodermic or puncture wound of some kind. So this just all starts to feel unsettling at best. So Dr. Francisco gets Sean's body. He does the autopsy and then does it super quick so he can get the body out. So it might have been a bit of a rush job, but he needed to get it to that funeral home. I'm not sure why. Maybe Jerry wanted the funeral like immediately. I don't know, but I'm going to say it straight up. That funeral was a mess. Jerry Lee showed up 10 minutes into the service, wearing the same white tuxedo and red ruffled shirt that he'd worn to his wedding less than 3 months before.
Oh boy.
One of Jerry's cousins was the only one to speak, and according to Sean's family, the entire service was about Jerry Lee, and nothing was ever said about Sean at her own funeral.
Oh my God.
Which is so incredibly gutting to me. She deserves so much more than she got. So just know in my heart, Sean's a blanket girl.
Absolutely.
And since it wasn't said at her funeral, I'm saying it now. Sean was loved by everyone who met her. She was nicknamed Little Buzz for how she always buzzed around from person to person like a true social butterfly. She was spunky and fun and deserved so much more than a life with Jerry Lee Lewis. Unfortunately, she is buried in the Lewis family plot. But before anyone thinks I'm once again being too harsh on Jerry for how he reacted in the face of tragedy, I just want to say the day after the funeral, Jerry was back at Hernando's hideaway with 2 girls by his side. Witnesses say the girls were dancers from the strip club Gigi's Angels. Jerry Lee's manager, JW, said, quote, he'll come back from this. The first 2 days, you could tell he was really bothered, but after that, he got it together. Oh, thank God. I thought he might be sad for weeks after the death of his wife. What a relief to hear he bounced back in just 3 days. And while I'd love to give good news about this particular case, I don't really have any. Since the cause of death was initially unknown, and because the victim was only 25 years old, a grand jury inquiry was done. The only reason to do such an inquiry is to try and dispel some of the suspicion surrounding the case. So shortly after Sean's death, the jury is assembled. And while this feels like good news, oh, dear listeners, don't get your hopes up. The housekeeper, Lottie, as well as both first responders, were on standby, but were never called to testify during all of this. The only witnesses the jury heard from were the prosecutor, Deputy McCauley, and the coroner, Dr. Jerry Francisco. Jerry Lee wasn't even on the standby list of witnesses. And how that is even possible, I'll never know. He was allegedly the last one to see her alive. But apparently that didn't matter. Deliberation was about 3 hours, and in the end, the jury found no evidence of potential foul play. The thing is, before they came up with this conclusion, the lab reports from the crime scene hadn't even come back yet. And the Mississippi State Lab was still analyzing the pills and syringes they found at the house. But apparently, none of that mattered. And like Jerry Lee's manager once said, quote, listen, they'll never bust him in DeSoto County. That's like busting Elvis in Memphis. Never, never. And you can quote me on that. 4 days after the grand jury made their decision, Jerry celebrated his 48th birthday at Hernando's hideaway.
Ugh.
And I know what you're thinking. What about Deputy McCauley's report? The one that mentioned that Jerry was slurring and he had what appeared to be blood on his robe. Didn't the grand jury react to that in any way? Well, no, because they didn't see it. That particular report didn't make it into the investigative file and didn't leave the sheriff's department until after the grand jury decision was made. And I know we're all good and riled up, but before we move on, because yes, somehow we still have even more shit of this man's life to wade through.
Jesus.
I'd like to take a few moments to share some Jerry and Sean stories, not to sway you one way or the other, just to give you a real picture of them as a couple. From my understanding, these stories all occurred in the 77 days that they were married. One day, Sean called her mother to share the exciting news that she just got a Lhasa Apso puppy. The next time Sean called home, she said, "Oh, yeah, she had to give the dog away because Jerry got jealous." Jealous of a dog.
Jesus.
Then there was the time that Sean's sister Shelley was visiting, and after Jerry propositioned the women with a threesome and they declined, Jerry slapped Shelley on the thigh and then backhanded her. He grabbed Sean by the hair and dragged her across the room. Sean told Shelley it wasn't a good idea to go to the police because they were with Jerry and, quote, they'd be trying to find a way to get me for causing trouble for him. After Sean's death, her mother Janice asked Jerry about that specific incident. Jerry said, quote, "I might have slapped him, but I never drugged Sean off anywhere." Janice said she heard otherwise. And Jerry said, quote, "Well, how would you like to wake up with your wife dead next to you?" Janice said, "Well, they told me she was in another room." And Jerry said, quote, "Well, she's dead and I'm alive." And we can't forget the time that Sean threatened to leave. And Jerry said, quote, "You're my wife and I'll kill you before you leave."
Oh, wow.
And I should say multiple friends and family members have separately corroborated that Sean had told them all of this separately prior to her death. And then there's the story of when a friend came to visit Sean and the friend brought her brother along with her. And Jerry took that as a sign that the brother was trying to be set up with Sean. So according to the friend, he started knocking Sean around, and then he tried to get Sean and the friend to have a threesome with him.
Oh my God.
Yeah, that theme keeps coming up because yet another night fight over a threesome happened just 3 days before Sean's death. Jerry went to good old Hernando's, picked up 2 women. He brings them home and told Sean they're having a 3-way. Sean said, like hell, and they had a massive fight. And just one more Jerry and Sean story, because I know we're all enjoying them. On August 23rd, Sean called her mother at 3:30 in the morning to say she was leaving Jerry if and when she could get away from him. Her mother tried to calm her down and said, "Just call me tomorrow." Sean said she didn't know if she'd be able to call, but, quote, "Whatever you do, make sure nobody calls for me here." They hung up, and the next morning, Sean was dead. Now, again, I'm not telling you these things to sway you one way or the other, but in the spirit of fairness and objectivity, how about I give you Jerry Lee's side of this story?
Sure.
Jerry Lee said, and I quote, "I loved Sean very much. She was a good girl, a fine person. She just made a mistake. I thought she was taking a handful of aspirin or something, and she took some methadone pills that were prescribed to me 2 years ago that I don't even fool with. They were just sitting on my cabinet. She didn't know what they were, and they killed her. It made me mad, real mad." Which I find interesting that if it's a prescription from 2 years ago, it's just sitting right there openly, that she might, like, so easily accessible, she might have mistook it.
And that we know that it would be a minimum 10, up between 10 and 40 pills.
Yeah.
It was like, oh, there's my wife just taking a mitt full of pills like any other normal night.
Yep.
Jeez.
Oh, Jerry also said, quote, "She didn't die until 30 minutes before we woke up." Someone questioned him, "Who's the we?" What do you mean before we woke up? Jerry said, quote, before I woke up, excuse me, before I woke up, wishing it could have been a we. I didn't know she was dead. She was still warm and everything. And I kept trying to wake her. And then I got to thinking about it and I still wouldn't accept her being dead. She lived all through the night. I know a couple of times I checked Sean through the night to see if she was breathing. I just felt her heart beating and everything, and it was perfect. Checking someone's breathing throughout the night is not a normal activity, Jerry. Not unless you have a reason to suspect that that person would stop breathing. But okay, maybe Jerry is just terrible with words. Again, for the sake of fairness and objectivity, let's look at what Jerry's manager and friend J.W. Witten had to say about Sean's death. J.W. said, quote, people come to hang the drapes. They wake him up. That's when he tried to wake her up because it was her project. That's a woman's job. He noticed her lips were blue. He couldn't wake her. He smashed the wall with his hand, cut his thumb. That's where the blood came from. He walked her up and down the hall, carrying her, shaking her, finally laid her on the bed, called for Lottie to get an ambulance. The thing is, JW, goldsmiths, which is the people who arrived at the house to hang the drapes, they said they never spoke with Jerry, but they stood outside the house knocking on the front door for 30 minutes. While they waited, Lottie arrived at 12:20, and as she was putting her key in the door to let them in, Jerry suddenly opened the door and went with Lottie into the master bedroom. They stayed in there for 30 minutes before the ambulance arrived and 15 minutes before the ambulance was even called. JW later claimed that Jerry told him that Sean announced to Jerry that she had taken a bunch of pills. He offered to take her to the hospital, but when he found out that his prescriptions were untouched, he decided she was bluffing, and he just went to bed. The next morning, he woke up and Sean was dead. So did you think she was bluffing, or did you actually worry and check on her breathing all night? Which is it?
And if you were like, oh, I watched her accidentally take the wrong pills, like, why wouldn't you get her help in that moment?
Yep. Now, of course, we are not saying that Jerry had anything to do with Sean's death. We are just speculating here. Moving on.
Yeah.
Now, in the 1980s, record labels weren't exactly breaking down Jerry's door. He did eventually sign a deal with MCA, but those recordings didn't yield any hits. And just when Jerry Lee thought his life might quiet down, on February 14th, 1984, Jerry found out he was being indicted by a federal grand jury for tax evasion. Prosecutors claim that between 1975 and 1980, Jerry tried to hide assets under the name of other people in an attempt to avoid having them seized and having to pay over $1 million in taxes. 2 days after receiving the notice, Jerry turned himself in, pleading not guilty. He was released on $100,000 bond after the owner of Hernando's Hideaway put the club up as collateral. And in case you're worried that Jerry turning himself in, don't worry about him. He didn't go alone. When he arrived at the police station to be fingerprinted and photographed, he brought along his new girlfriend, 21-year-old Carrie Lynn McCarver. Jerry told Carrie that being processed was a breeze. The couple met during one of Jerry Lee's many trips to Hernando's Hideaway since the death of his wife 5 months before. About 2 months after their appearance at the police station, and exactly 8 months to the day after Sean's death, Carrie became wife number 6 on April 24th, 1984. Also in 1984, Jerry Lee was found innocent of evading taxes, although the IRS once again seized property from the Lewis Ranch in 1985, this time including a jet ski, multiple cars, and a mechanical bull.
Oh my God.
Which I know I don't know him personally, but classic Jerry.
So Jerry.
Yeah. Jerry Lee went on trial in October 1984, facing a maximum sentence of 5 years for tax fraud. When the jury came in with the verdict, Jerry Lee was sitting in the courtroom with his new wife. Jerry said, quote, I saw 2 or 3 young women on the jury winked at me and gave me the okay sign. So I knew I was in.
Ah.
And he was. The jury truly believed that Jerry meant to do right by the government, but that he mistakenly lets someone less righteously inclined handle his business. The charges against Jerry Lee were dropped, but he still owed the government more than $600,000. In 1986, Jerry Lee entered the Betty Ford Clinic, although he later claims he only did it because a tabloid paid him $30,000 to do so.
Mm-hmm.
And while his marriage had been rocky up to that point, it was apparently this brief stint in rehab that allowed Jerry and his wife Carrie to patch things up. And soon Carrie was pregnant. And at first, Jerry denied that the child was his. That is, until he found out that the baby was a boy. On January 28th, 1987, they welcomed Jerry Lee Lewis III. Jerry told reporters that there was no doubt that this was his boy. And I know that Jerry is already so gross, especially for denying that it was his child until learning the child's gender. But can we just talk about the ages for just one sec? I know in the grand scheme of life, age doesn't really matter, especially later in life. But at the time of their son's birth, Carrie was 24. Jerry Lee was 51.
Oof.
To say he has a type would be an understatement. But again, I'm not shaming the age difference. I'm just going to point out Jerry Lee's wife was born December 1962, and Jerry Lee's daughter was born August 1963.
Yeah.
In 1988, Jerry Lee filed for bankruptcy, claiming he was more than $3 million in debt to 21 different creditors, including $2 million to the IRS. And for those who like when I talk inflation, the IRS debt would be over 6.6 million in 2021, and his overall debt would have been about 10 million. Apparently, some of these debts included unpaid bills from 3 hospitals, court fees, state income taxes, a bill from the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and lease payments that he failed to make on both his Cadillac and Corvette. In the early 90s, Jerry Lee's career had gone, for lack of better words, stale. But by the spring of 1993, the IRS were back to hounding Jerry about more potential tax problems. So he did what any celebrity would do, and that's move to Dublin, Ireland, where musicians are exempt from taxes under Irish law.
Oh, boy.
While the Lewis family was in Ireland, the IRS hired a locksmith to get into the Lewis Ranch in Mississippi and emptied the home of nearly everything, including a pinball machine, pool table, riding lawnmower, a Cadillac, 2 grand pianos, all furniture, and 8 swords. Why a man needs 8 swords, I will never know.
Yeah.
I'm not an 8 sword lady, I guess.
No.
The IRS planned an auction, but Carrie was able to get a restraining order to delay it. And after Jerry filed for bankruptcy, the family was able to buy back some of their items.
Oh, sure. Maybe 6 of the swords.
Well, fingers crossed. Because how do you sleep at night with less than 6 swords?
I don't know.
That's maybe why you and I don't sleep very well. Not enough swords.
Get more swords.
Yeah. After living in Ireland for a year, the Lewis family returned to the ranch. In July 1994, Jerry Lee agreed to pay $560,000 of the $4.1 million tax bill. And since he wasn't really selling records or touring at this point, he earned the money by opening the ranch up to fans and playing music for them on guided tours of his home. And again, for my inflation fans, in 2021 terms, Jerry agreed to pay just over $1 million of his $7.5 million debt. How he was allowed to do that, I will never know.
Yeah, for real.
Throughout the 90s and early 2000s, Jerry Lee's health declined. So he didn't make any records, not to mention the fact that he couldn't find anyone who was willing to produce his work. Jerry Lee also claims his marriage to Carrie had grown unhappy.
Oh.
But he wasn't the only one in the family who disliked Carrie. Jerry Lee's daughter, Phoebe, described Carrie as a, quote, horrible bitch who was possessed by the devil and only shopped at Walmart.
Oh my God.
The claim was that Carrie moved into the Lewis Ranch. She painted the walls, floors, cupboards, and even the grand piano all gold. Phoebe said that, quote, Carrie told me she was leaving, but I was going to run her ass off anyway. Carrie filed for divorce in 1998, but it took until 2004 before it was finalized. And psychologist hat, I can't help but wonder if the issue for Phoebe was more that she saw Carrie as competition for her father's attention. Phoebe once said, quote, I was born to take care of my daddy. I never married, don't want to have kids. I'm not going to steal his money or give him drugs. So if she felt that strongly about being the person who cared for her father, she probably didn't like that he married a woman less than a year her age.
Ooh, yeah.
But then came a time when Phoebe felt that her father needed someone other than her to care for him. So in 2010, Phoebe hired Judith Ann Brown as Jerry Lee's new caregiver. And the thing about Judith, it turns out she was married to Jerry's third wife, Myra's little brother, Rusty, from 1984 to 2004.
Oh boy.
At some point after that, Judith got married again. But when Phoebe hired her in 2010, Judith divorced her husband, moved from her home in Georgia to live at the ranch in Nesbitt to cook and help care for Jerry Lee. She said when she arrived, she found a man in need of attention. Judith said Jerry was, quote, lethargic, out of it. He had systemic infections like shingles and pneumonia. And one quote I found interesting. This is from Judith, quote, he was scared of needles. He was afraid of the old demon he had beaten back after a lifetime. And of course, he feared needles. Numerous people in Jerry's past all claimed to have witnessed him injecting drugs directly into his stomach. Allegedly.
Oh my God.
While Judith cared for Jerry, they reminisced about old times and their similar upbringings. And before long, they fell in love.
Oh, stop it.
Because after all, they met decades before because Jerry Lee, or she married Jerry Lee's brother-in-law. Apparently, Jerry Lee told his brother-in-law, Rusty, that if he didn't marry this woman, he would. He was married to Myra at the time. Well, I guess he wouldn't have been married to Myra. He was married to somebody else at the time, but I guess that doesn't matter to him anyway. Judith says she was probably in love with Jerry even back then, which I'm sure her ex-husband loves to hear.
Yeah, for real.
In Christmas 2010, which was just mere months after her dropping her whole life to move in with Jerry, Jerry gave Judith a diamond ring and then months later told her, oh yeah, that ring I gave you, it was my promise to marry you. I assume they were waiting for her divorce to be finalized. I could be wrong. Jerry Lee was hospitalized in January and February 2012 for a nagging stomach problem and a new bout of pneumonia. But thankfully, Jerry was well enough to make things official with wife number 7. On March 9th, 2012, 72-year-old Jerry said I do to 62-year-old Judith Brown. And for once, it's nice to see Jerry Lee Lewis wedding, where I'm not concerned about the ages of the bride and groom. Now, here is where things in their relationship get interesting. Up to this point, Phoebe's entire life was her father. In fact, she was even his manager. But when Jerry and Judith started to get close, Phoebe and her mother, Myra, started to get concerned as they were worried that Judith was just after Jerry Lee's money. Between 2006 and 2014, Jerry Lee released 3 albums that were all critically acclaimed and commercially successful. But Judith said money was never the reason for her being with Jerry Lee. Quote, there was not much of that. Hadn't been for some time. Judith claims Phoebe offered her $200 and the old Buick as an incentive to leave, and that if she didn't, warned her, well, Jerry might kill you. But Jerry says Judith is, quote, the best of them, better than all of them put together. So Jerry could not be happier with Judith. Phoebe, not a fan.
Yeah.
And just days after their wedding in March 2012, Jerry Lee fired Phoebe as his manager and took away her power of attorney and gave it to Judith.
Ooh.
The court disputes dragged on for years, and in 2017, Jerry sued his own daughter, claiming she owed him money and that she defamed him on social media. Phoebe countersued, but a judge has since thrown out most of these suits. In February 2019, Jerry Lee suffered a minor stroke, but less than a year later, he was back in the studio recording an album of gospel classics. In March 2021, 85-year-old Jerry Lee and his 71-year-old wife, Judith, renewed their wedding vows on their 9th anniversary, which is not usually done, but I guess that's what they want. The reverend who performed the ceremony, who also happened to be Jerry Lee's cousin, said, quote, "Killer, you may kiss the bride." The ceremony was held at the Lewis Ranch in front of 100 guests who were all required to test negative for COVID before they could attend the private party. So I guess if nothing else, the single positive thing that I will say about Jerry Lee is that he takes COVID seriously. In a career that has spanned over 60 years, Jerry Lee Lewis has received a dozen gold records in both rock and country. He has won 4 Grammy Awards and had numerous #1 hit singles. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1986, as well as the Rockabilly Hall of Fame. He was also one of the first inductees into the Memphis Music Hall of Fame. But what Jerry wants more than anything in the world is to be inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. But apparently that might be a bit of a tall order. On January 20th, 1973, Jerry performed at the Grand Ole Opry Live. And while artists were typically given 8 minutes, Jerry decided to play for 40 minutes, including through commercial breaks. And not only that, he played more rock and roll as opposed to country music, which feels like a bad choice when playing at the Grand Ole Opry. And if that wasn't bad enough, he also dropped multiple F-bombs during the live televised event.
Oh my God.
So if country music's memory is long enough, maybe Jerry Lee will never get his wish. And I get why he wants it. He did have more than 20 top 10 country hits, including 4 that reached #1. But you know what my wish is? My wish is that either he never gets into the Country Music Hall of Fame, or that if he does get in, it's posthumously so that he doesn't know about it. I just don't want him to feel joy. There, I've said it. And just like that, Petty Rubble's in the house. And the last thing I'll say about Jerry Lee Lewis, in his later years, he was asked about his life. And he said, quote, "I never done anything I'm ashamed of." Well, Jerry, if you need help coming up with anything, I've got a list. Reporting for True Crime and Cocktails, I'm Christy Oxborrow.
Oh, God, what a glorious finish. Listen, we're going to take one last break. I need one more wine. Hit the loo. We're going to be right back and finish up our thoughts on Jerry Lee Lewis on this episode of True Crime and Cocktails. Welcome back to this episode of True Crime and Cocktails. Of course, we're discussing Jerry Lee Lewis. Now, I have taken some chaotic notes, as I am known to do on this show. So I'm just going to go through them as best I can. They're not going to be in chronological order or in any sort of. Yeah, I mean, I'll try, but no. And then I also have some thoughts on the murders. I mean, the deaths. First of all, you mentioned at the very beginning that Junior, his older brother, who very tragically died, was the good son. Shout out to the movie The Good Son, starring Elijah Wood and Macaulay Culkin. Again, I I just read the notes as I write them, folks. That's all I can
think
say.
we all prefer it that way.
Next, Crazy Arms. Oh, that does sound like the devil's music. That was my next note. Oh yeah, there's lots. Now, the next thing you talked about was about how Jerry Lee Lewis, it wasn't the next thing you talk about. It's the next note I saw on my list, which again are not in order. Something else you talked about was how Jerry Lee Lewis talked about how his biggest musical inspiration was himself. And that made me think of the interview where Matthew McConaughey, I believe, said that his biggest hero was him in the future. Have you heard this?
I have not.
I may be getting this wrong, but I believe the quote was, he was like, it's me 20 years from now. And 20 years from now, my biggest hero is going to be me 20 years from then. And I was like, you've jumped your own shark, McConaughey. Stop it. Then I just wrote, somebody put R. Kelly back in the closet. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then I said, why was Elvis drafted and JLL wasn't? Am I writing JLL now? I guess I am. Instead of Jerry Lee Lewis.
Yeah. Oh, I get it. Oh, are you kidding me? Most of the stuff I wrote out by hand, I put JLL. I could have literally written just J. I knew who I was talking about.
Nope.
That's not who I am.
It's like JTT, but in a bad way.
Yeah.
Shout out to JTT.
Shout out to JTT.
And if you don't know who JTT is, Google it. Okay. And then I just wrote Phoebe blankets. She needs it. She needs it.
All the women he's ever come into contact with, I'm convinced, need a blanket.
Well, another note I wrote was Myra, Stockholm Syndrome. I wrote that before you even got halfway through her story. And then you said that she came out later saying she had been abused. That did not shock me at all. I was like, you're 13 when you get caught up in all of that. Oh, again, blankets. Okay. Then I wrote, he was huge in England, like us. Again, my notes are chaotic. You just have to go with me.
I'm living for this, by the way.
I'm so glad. What I like is that they're so chaotic. Like I have to take this time to like scan very quickly to even see what I even want to talk about, which is tough. I will say this. So forgive me. Oh, then I wrote Jerry and Jaron, terrible alliteration. Then Jerry and Carrie, no better.
Yeah, I know that I have thrown a lot of very similar sounding names, not to mention how many names, but I mean, good God, the man had 7 wives and like so many children. Like, I can't.
Here's the thing I'll say. So his wife, Jaron, who had the restraining order, he threatened, who of course drowned, which was ruled accidental. I swear to you, I wrote down he had access to drugs. Did he inject her? I swear to God, I wrote that down. And that's before you brought up anything about this second wife and the potential hypodermic needle injection. Again, this is all speculation and alleging, but that was the first thing that hit me. It was like no one was in the exact vicinity and she drowned in an above ground pool. And we know that he had access to methadone. You had already established that. That was literally what immediately came into my mind. And then when it became on the table for the next wife's death, I was like, oh boy.
And it's just the fact that both happened so quickly as well, for me, was my thing. They both died within like a year of each other.
And when we already know he has a history of abuse with basically every other woman / wife he's been with, it's like, we all know, again, you know, I know that I've been making a lot of jokes, but to be serious for a second, like domestic violence does not typically end well. It can escalate. It's of course, like we've talked about on the show recently, it's like if a person, if any person very unfortunately turns up dead, the first person you look at is the closest person to them, which is usually a romantic partner.
Mm-hmm.
And quite often, again, if domestic violence is involved, that is a very easy escalation, And again, I'm not saying that whatever, but you know what I'm saying.
Of course.
Him paying for the autopsy is such a conflict of interest. I feel like that should not be allowed. I don't know if that's allowed now legally or not, but I feel like it shouldn't be. I feel like it should not. It's one thing if there's like the autopsy that's done and then people in the family are like, I think there's something else going on and they want to pay for another. That's a different story. But like, if the only autopsy you're going off of is paid for by only her romantic partner, I think that's a huge problem.
Mm-hmm.
I also love that you brought up earlier that he had to have so much of his stomach removed. And then it got brought up that he had been injecting himself in his stomach when he was in the height of his drug issues. Wow, my goodness. So, and then of course the whole thing about like, he'd never get busted here. It's like, this just feels like it's all written out. The deputy, all of the above, it just feels like there's like a full story here. Then I wrote down Jerry's den and then next to it, Stacy's mom. I guess when you said Jerry's den, what I heard was Jerry's den is where it's going in. Not something I'm proud of. Not something I'm proud of at all. I'm just telling you what I hear and what the notes are. And
it's
my
all
final
I
note,
want, and I've waited so long.
Thank you so much.
Stacey,
my final note.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Here's the last thing I'm going to say. We talked in a little episode we entitled The Glee Curse, which is a common phrase, not something we came up with, about how it felt like there was just, and I know that I went on a little bit of my personal, I get into energies and stuff on this show.
Mm-hmm.
It does feel to me that this feels like another situation where energies, if you believe in that, come into play. He very sadly lost 2 sons.
Yeah.
Of course, he lost his brother when his brother was only 9 and he was 2. I just always, and then of course the 2 wives of his, regardless of whether or not, I know we've been alleging a lot, but regardless of anything else, it just felt to me. And there was also, of course, this like interesting religious component to his career, right? Where it was like early on, it's like, crazy arms, you're invoking the devil, that kind of thing. Like,
yeah.
I'm not suggesting that I feel that Jerry Lee Lewis's Great Balls of Fire was invoking the devil, but it's interesting that he was known to be a performer who specifically was connected with, again, like in his college and stuff like that, that it was like, oh, you're of the flesh or whatever. I'm paraphrasing.
Thank you for that.
You're very welcome. But he was connected with those kinds of themes, and that there's just so much surrounding him in terms of all kinds of issues. Again, he had substance use issues. He had multiple issues with the law. There's of course also the person in his life that was shot. And then he was like, it was the glass, when it was like, you said, look down the barrel. And then also there was a bullet in him and you're claiming it's the glass. And then again, all of the deaths surrounding his family and him specifically in his life. My question, of course, would be, is it possible? Because his parents talked about how it's like he was a virtuoso from a young age. And they also talked about how his older brother, who again very sadly died, was very musical. Is it possible? I am alleging, I'm throwing this out there, in the realm of batshit crazy, 3 glasses of wine deep.
Yeah.
Is it possible someone in his family was like, we love music or whatever, one of these children or this child or what have you, we want them to have a gift, and made a deal?
I like that. I just feel like you're looking for the devil now. Like,
I'm not.
And
I'm
live
not.
for it.
I'm not.
Oh God, no.
I'm not.
No, I like you see that more. There's
I just
definitely
feel like
something about the energies, the fact that his brother was like, oh, he is this golden child. He has a musical gift. And then suddenly he's gone. And it's like, well, now we're going to put all of that hope into the next one. And I,
Again, and I know that I'm taking a leap because a lot of people, I'm sure, would say that they don't believe in that, etc., which I get. But I'm saying in a world where anything is possible,
sure.
is it possible that could have happened then? Or is it possible that at some point in his life that he could have welcomed that in? I just think it's interesting that for somebody who, and I know that it was the time period, I get that. But it's interesting for someone who became so synonymous with being like, you're of the devil, the devil, the devil.
Yeah.
There was just so much surrounding him and so much death of young people, of children, of innocence. That just feels, again, like for me, like I can't think about it too long because it creeps me out pretty deeply.
Sure.
Last thing, I missed this one. You said Pocket Full of Pills. And then that made me think of the song Pocket Full of Sunshine. And then I was like, oh my gosh, is Pocket Full of Sunshine about having a pocket full of pills? Take me away. You know what I'm saying?
That makes me think of the movie Easy A, which that's like a home run. I love that movie. Stanley Tucci.
You love him.
I love him. Him and I believe it's Patricia Clarkson.
Yes.
They are my favorite couple in like movie history. Like the two of them are everything I want as like a relationship. They're so lovely. And there's like a bit in the movie where it's like they're having family movie night. And the mom is like, well, Stanley Tucci, dad gets to pick the movie because he was voted family member of the week. And the kids are like, well, that's not fair because you vote. You're the only one who votes and you vote him every week. And she's like, well, it's not my fault. He's my favorite. And it's just, they're so lovely and charming and so funny. And that movie is wonderful. And it also has, oh my God, why am I blanking on her name? I'm very embarrassed. Phoebe.
Lisa Kudrow?
Thank you. It has Lisa Kudrow in it, who, and Emma Stone, of course. But yeah, I love that movie. So I hope that song isn't about drugs.
I'm going to look it up.
I mean, it's more than possible. I love The Weeknd, and don't worry, I know. Yeah, I know his Can't Feel My Face. I know. But oh my God. Yeah, I don't know.
Come on.
It's possible.
It's possible. Now listen, did you have any other final thoughts? Do you agree with me that maybe, I don't know, someone summoned the demon, the devil, the afterlife, the whatever?
I mean, I definitely believe in something about energies. And I think there is an energy in him that just draws negative to him because that's all he is. That's all I see him as. The fact that 6 of his 7 wives have commented about the abuse physically and emotionally and all of that they have put up with from him. His current wife has said nothing of that nature, although he was like a feeble old man by the time they met. So I bet he could not physically do anything, but you can't tell me he's not, at least verbally. Allegedly, I'm speculating. I'm just saying, of course, you don't just suddenly change overnight. And my thing is, it's just like, I knew about him. I knew his music. Didn't overly care for it. I'm more of an Elvis girl myself. Nope, just had to dig him one last time.
Of course.
But I had no idea he'd been married that many times. I knew he was married to his 13-year-old cousin because, again, I grew up on Great Balls of Fire, the movie. But I like that movie just completely glosses over so many like other wives in his life and all of that kind of thing. And then I never heard that two of his wives had died.
Yeah.
And suspiciously, and that we're just all okay with it. Like, it's when a celebrity is allowed to get away with absolutely anything just because of who they are. That is what really irks me the most. And I mean, again, I'm not saying he did anything. I'm just saying, wow, the evidence really points you in a direction, doesn't it?
Well, and again, when we're working off of an autopsy report paid for by
Secondhand. Yeah.
Somebody who would be considered to be at least a suspect, again, in general. That's or I shouldn't say suspect, but somebody that the police would typically look into initially.
Yes.
And also when we know that the sheriff's deputy had a vested interest in this person, and that was a person on the scene.
Mm-hmm.
Like all the details, it just feels yeah, you know what it is? You know what it is? It's the it's that there's a reason why there's rules. And you and I love rules.
Yeah.
Season 3, no rules, no boundaries, but there's definitely boundaries. We love rules in the sense that it's like there are some rules that are there for a reason.
Yes.
And when we talk about true crime and we talk about protocol, there are protocols that exist for a reason, because if someone turns up dead in a strange manner,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I can speak for both of us when I say, if it was one of us or somebody we loved, we would want the protocol followed. That it's like, it's not like, right? Like, it's not like
Mm-hmm.
any old person can say, well, this, that, the other thing. So I think when it feels like you see things and it goes, well, it's not just that he paid for the autopsy, and it's not just that there was a potential conflict of interest with the deputy, but it's those things combined, and those things combined could, you know, make a big difference in
Mm-hmm.
how a death is handled. It just sets up some flags. Like I've
Yeah.
said before on this show, and I stand by it. If God forbid, and again, I put out there, may it never happen, but if God forbid somebody in my life ever was taken in a terrible way, and I do legitimately, I cast it out. I'm not putting that out there. I would want to be investigated as hard as the law wants to come at me, because I know that you would never be able to make a case against me, because I know I would be innocent.
Right.
And also, you should be looking. That's where you should be looking. And so again, it's like when the places that it's always the first place that detectives look, just across the board. When that kind of becomes, meddled with, I said it. It leaves you with a gross feeling. It feels icky. No matter how you want to slice it, it feels icky. And when somebody, again, he has a history of domestic violence as reported by basically all of his other partners, that's also a huge fact in the case. That's a huge, it's not like he had 6 wives who all said, oh, he was a great guy, he treated me wonderfully, and it just didn't work out. He had 6 wives prior, or however many prior, 5 or 6, saying, oh, he was violent, he was terrible, he treated me poorly, he abused me.
Yeah. And the thing that I don't know if I'd say bothers me the most, but the thing that gets me is nothing will ever be done about this, because if they want to exhume her body as her husband, they would need his permission. And there's no way he's going to say yes to that. And he'll give some bullshit that it would be disrespectful to do that. And it's like, no, trying to, find out if she was murdered is, a good thing. But, and the fact that she's buried in his family's plot probably means that there's no way that her family would ever be able to have her body re-examined by someone who wasn't paid thousands of dollars to do it. It's different when you're, paid by the county because that's your job.
Exactly.
When you're brought in and paid so much money, I mean, it's insane.
Well, listen, Christy Oxborrow, you hit it out of the park like you always do. Never a dull moment on True Crime and Cocktails, not with these two at the helm.
Well, not when I am constantly yelling at an old man who's never going to hear this. God, I hope he doesn't hear this. I don't want him to hear this.
Yeah. Yeah, no, we don't want that. But listen, I think this was a great story, a very compelling story. I had no idea of about 97 to 98% of this. So very, again, very compelling. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your research. Thank you for inspiring my chaotic notes, which I had a joy taking. Just a joy. I'll find things through these in the next couple of days and I'll just text you. I'll text you my additional notes that I missed.
I like that.
Out of context. I won't even tell you. I'll just put it and you'll be like, I know what she means.
Yeah.
Thank you to all of you for listening to this episode of True Crime and Cocktails. If you'd like to give us a follow on social media, you can. Instagram, Facebook, YouTube at True Crime and Cocktails, Twitter at Not Detectives, Patreon, patreon.com/True Crime and Cocktails, where we have a subscription service where we offer bonus episodes, live Q&As, all sorts of fun things. We have a whole lot of fun over there. So check it out if you'd like to learn a little bit more. And all of our merch is available at truecrewmerch.com. For any other questions, hit up the website, truecrimeandcocktails.com. Christy, do you want to tell the people about next week's episode?
Oh, yeah. When I find my notes that say, are you sure you want me to say it? Because I mean, it's kind of your episode.
I mean, you can say it if you want, and then I'll chime in.
Oh, do you want me to go for all of the names? I don't know how to say it right. Do I just say the last name or do I say all of it?
Say all of it.
Oh, okay. On the next True Crime and Cocktails, John Wayne Gacy.
That's right. It's a Lauren Ash serial killer special. We're back in the fold, and I'm going to tell you all about the true monster, the killer clown, John Wayne Gacy. I hope I don't give myself nightmares this week in my research process. What a true monster. Can't wait to get into it with all of you. Thank you all for being here. We're so grateful to all of you. We wouldn't be able to make a show without you listening. I mean, we could, but again, it'd be a whole lot less fun. So we're so glad that you're here. Christy, do you want to say goodnight to the people?
Good night, Dave Grohl.
Good night, time traveling us.